dish she hides the rest. They'll never know the very best.
How can we help you, Mrs.
Klein. Miss Carol Klein. It's my brother, Dan. I'm so worried. The police have not been helpful.
They're not, as a rule, Miss Klein, but we are.
Tried by eyes from every side. Through smoke and haze, men see her and sigh. But behind the dirt, she hides the rest. They'll never know the very best. There's so much more she keeps in store. They'll never see behind her door, unless they see her through private eyes.
Are you going to leave, or do I have to make you dance?
Through private eyes.
He needed killing.
Through private
Jesus!
eyes.
Mine like kissed him.
A woman has faces along with airs and graces, but there's only one true woman inside.
The Dame Was Loaded is a point-and-click FMV adventure developed by Australia's Beam Software and published in November 1995. The game transports players back to the 1940s and plants them in the well-worn leather shoes of one Scott Anger, a washed-up private eye working the cheap side of Los Angeles. When a small-town girl from Oregon walks into his office and asks for help finding her brother, Anger sees a chance to play hero, pay off his debts, and maybe even piece his life back together. But what begins as a simple case of a missing person soon sends Anger into the seedy underbelly of the City of Angels, and puts him on the trail of a cache of missing diamonds. With only 3 days to spare, he'll have to track down dames and dolls, dirtbags of every walk of life, and even a few dead men in pursuit of answers. Anger has only a handful of friends left in this town, and with a fortune in ice at stake, how many of those can he really trust? Each new piece of evidence introduces a new twist to the tale, and it's not long before Anger finds the case wrapping so far back on itself that it begins pointing towards his own sordid past. The Dame Was Loaded was developed at the height of the games industry's full-motion video craze, and generally adhered to the basic gameplay formula utilised in similar titles of the mid-90s. But Beam Software also intended the project to wholly realise the fantasy of being a private detective in the vein of Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe or Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade. Thus, rather than abstracting the day-to-day activities of a fictional gumshoe, the game modelled both the glamorous and mundane work of a PI. In addition to bashing gun-toting button men and making sweet with broads, players would have to pick locks, pay off chiselers, peek under beds, and even pay heed to factors like sleep, rent, and personal grooming. The game therefore included mechanics such as time limits, a day and night cycle, limited inventory space, and fatigue. In addition, Dame played host to a semi-non-linear story in which the player's actions could block off or open up different avenues of investigation, as well as reactive NPCs who would change their responses or even cut off contact entirely based on dialogue choices or appearance. The Dame Was Loaded was Beam Software's first full-motion video adventure, and at the time was reportedly the most expensive interactive media production ever developed in Australia, bankrolled by electronics giant Philips for the relaunch of their CDI console, and starring a cast drawn from various Australian TV dramas. With its open-ended story and big-budget TV trimmings, the title was intended as the first entry in what was hoped would be a long-running series of Scott Anger adventures. The Dame Was Loaded received a mixed reception upon both its Australian launch in winter 1995 and its international release in spring the subsequent year. Though reviewers granted that the game featured an interesting premise, there was almost unanimous criticism of its unintuitive interface design, restrictive inventory limits, timed gameplay, and, according to some, inconsistent production values. PC Review gave Dame 76% and called it very much an adventure in the old school, arguing that its FMV footage concealed a competent and traditionalist point-and-click mystery. Reviewer MR remarked that though the game's reliance on still images and voiceover over animated clips could be jarring, it also meant Dame was more of a real game than some of its more movie-like contemporaries, and that though hammy acting and often irritating trial-and-error gameplay rendered the title, as he put it, more classy B-movie than blockbuster, it was nevertheless a worthy adventure. But PC Zone did not share this opinion, giving Dame 55% and dismissing it as an interactive movie. Charlie Brooker heaped scorn on both the game and its performances, complaining of droning, insipid voiceovers, half-assed on-funny dialogue, and a never-ending parade of Chandler-esque cliches, recommending that detective fans ignore the title and spend their hard-earned money on Access Software's Under a Killing Moon instead. And Next Generation were even more critical, branding Dame with an embarrassing score of 1 out of 5. The magazine likened the game to yet another lump of coal atop the mountain of generic FMV adventures already released that year, agreeing with Brooker that, though more interactive than some of its rivals, Dame's gameplay mechanics were merely a thin excuse for an experience built around cheesy movie clips that, in the end, amounted to no fun at all. Reviews from foreign language magazines were generally more forgiving than their British and American counterparts, with Australia's Hyper awarding Dame 82% and claiming it was proof that full motion video and engaging adventure gameplay were not mutually exclusive. David Wildgoose praised the game for its solid plot, intriguing investigative mechanics, and passable theatrics, and though disappointed by its lack of replay value, concluded that adventure gamers would derive plenty of enjoyment from the title. Germany's PC Spiel shared Hyper's feelings, awarding Dame 4 stars out of 5 for having fused the best of traditional Sierra-style adventures with high-quality modern production values. Manfred Kleiman favourably compared the title to the recent Gabriel Knight, The Beast Within, eulogising the non-linear narrative, high-resolution video, jazzy soundtrack, and compelling acting, restricting his criticism solely to the game's unreasonably tight time limit. Holland's Power Unlimited were slightly less enthusiastic, in rating Dame at 70%. Ben de Doet was impressed by the game's storytelling and presentation, in particular the sharp video footage, strong performances, hard-boiled narrative, and authentic set dressing, but accused Beam Software of grossly exaggerating in calling Dame an interactive experience, characterising it as more of a well-crafted clip show. And PC Joker typified more negative reviews in scoring the game at 47%, calling it both a bad game and a misguided attempt at film noir. Martin Schnell lamented that Beam Software had mined the detective fiction of Chandler, Hammett, and Spillane so extensively that their own story was painfully predictable and derivative, that the acting and audio mixing was amateurish and annoying, and that, in short, this particular Dame was not only boring, but also a waste of 90 marks. Although the Dame Was Loaded was intended for simultaneous release on PC, Mac, and Philips CDI, only the PC version was fully completed and received a wide retail launch. No further Scott Anger stories were developed at Beam Software, and with the failure of the CDI console and the PC gaming market already oversaturated with FMV adventures, the company shifted to the more popular strategy, sports, and racing genres, eventually being purchased by Anfagram in 1999. In 2018, an emulated version of The Dame Was Loaded was published on the digital download site Good Old Games, and subsequently added to the Steam and Fanatical storefronts, where as of February 2025 it remains available to purchase and play. In today's retrospective, we'll first be looking at the story behind the game's development, then reviewing its gameplay, art and sound design, and finally its storytelling and media influences. Check the chapter timestamps if you'd like to jump to a specific part of the video, or keep watching for the full context behind one of Australia's earliest excursions into the interactive multimedia market. Those of you still with us, let's head 30 years back to the land down under and learn about how Dungeons & Dragons and a proprietary new video processing technology led to a classic adventure tale of dames, dolls, and double-crossing moles.
Now, I am talking to you online via video camera. This is some severe science fiction shit. You know, back in 1994, oh my God, we can actually run decent video. 320 pixel kind of, resolution. Amazing. This is the future.
Surviving the interactive entertainment market could be a challenge for any company in the 1980s, but in Australia, where the games industry was impeded by high import taxes, limited government support, and a small population relative to the country's size, aspiring software houses had to be particularly sensitive to changing trends. One of the few big success stories in the wide brown land was Beam Software, which had been founded in 1980 after its founders, Melbourne House, smelled opportunity in the home computer market. According to co-founder Alfred Milgram, the company had learned a harsh lesson in the realities of the industry almost immediately after its incorporation, relating how in 1981 he had lighted a plane in Australia intending to demo their latest product for the ZX80 to British partners, only to arrive in London to the news that the ZX81's launch was imminent. It was a twist of fate that would illustrate to the company's leadership the speed at which computer technology was advancing. Initially publishing and developing titles for the ZX series, Beam's first smash hit was the licensed adventure game The Hobbit, which was unusual in featuring a quasi-real-time world that could develop in unexpected ways. The Hobbit saw strong international sales across a variety of platforms, and the company swiftly followed up its success with further adventure titles, including the 1984 detective mystery Sherlock, which built upon The Hobbit's innovations by retaining its semi-non-linear gameplay, but also enabling more complex interaction with non-player characters, taking a step towards realizing the dream of playing a master sleuth, skillfully wringing the truth from various persons of note. But like their British and American competitors, in the late 80s, Beam found the gaming landscape crumbling under their feet. The industry was shifting from 8-bit to 16-bit hardware, Japanese video game consoles were on the rise, and some systems upon which Beam's sales figures had once relied, primarily the Spectrum and Commodore brands, were entering a period of irrevocable decline. From 1990 onwards, Beam were primarily a gun for hire, developing licensed sports, action and platformer titles almost exclusively for Nintendo systems, perhaps the most notable being the well-received Super NES cyberpunk action RPG Shadowrun. But by 1994, the games industry was undergoing yet another seismic shift, this time a result of the increasing popularity of the compact disc.
Seriously, if I'm a computer user, what do I get for my money by going out and buying a CD-ROM drive and buying CD-ROM software?
Stuart, the amazing and exciting thing about CD-ROM is just the pure volume of data that you can get on one of these things. As most people know, you can get over 600 megabytes on one of these little disks. That's a few times the size of the average hard disk, and when you've got all that room, software developers can do some really incredible things.
To developers, the opportunity to build games around the large storage space offered by CD-ROMs bore obvious advantages, bigger games and much better production values. In some cases, the improvements were evolutionary. Many popular titles of the day were re-released with digitized speech, high-quality audio tracks, and even on-disc movies, albeit often using heavily compressed footage. But as CD-ROMs became a standard feature of both home computers and the upcoming generation of console hardware, some studios considered the possibility of constructing games almost entirely around what was often referred to as the multimedia format. The industry had begun experimenting with CD-ROM adventure games in the late 80s and early 90s, resulting in 1990's Spaceship Warlock, for example, which in turn inspired Presto Studios' The Journeyman project. But these early forays had been confined to specialist hardware like the CD-TV, Sega Mega CD, CDI, or the modestly sized Macintosh market, and were at the time still hampered by evolving system and software standards. It was not until around 1990 1993 that two so-called killer apps popularised this emerging genre. Cyan's Myst, which was a point-and-click adventure that utilised high-definition pre-rendered art in conjunction with computer-generated and live-action movie clips, and Trilobyte's The Seventh Guest, which also combined cutting-edge audio-visual content with puzzle-driven adventure gaming. Both games, originally developed for the Mac, would go on to sell several million copies apiece, in part due to being released concurrently or swiftly ported to Windows PCs, and in part due to their accessibility to mainstream audiences. Unlike many games, even those in the graphic adventure genre, their interface, control scheme, and overall mechanics were not much more complicated to the average consumer than navigating the multimedia encyclopedias or educational software that had become a staple of home computer systems. But as revolutionary as the CD-ROM might have been, it was not a silver bullet for hardware limitations. Even more powerful home computers struggled to play back pre-rendered or live-action footage at an acceptable frame rate and resolution, and the CD-ROM drives themselves had their drawbacks, read speed being the most significant, with typical consumer drives so sluggish that Myst, like any other game reliant on streaming from a disk, had to be constructed from the ground up around the slowest data transfer speeds of machines meeting its minimum requirements. There was also the question of what it was exactly that games built around video clips actually brought to the table in terms of gameplay. Both Myst and Seventh Guest may have achieved the holy grail of mainstream success, but they were not universally admired by consumer-oriented publications. Though not in the majority at that time, a number of contemporaneous reviewers broke ranks with their peers and criticised both games as little more than novelties, wafer-thin, quasi-interactive slideshows bereft of engaging gameplay or mechanical depth. Nevertheless, the unprecedented media coverage and rich profits being generated by both titles ensured that within a year of their release, the rest of the industry, which had already begun tentatively exploring the potential of interactive movies, rushed to capitalise on the trend, much to the chagrin of their critics. Trade shows were soon awash in what were variously described as CD-ROM games, full-motion video adventures, or interactive fiction. The latter two labels highlighted a particularly interesting avenue of exploration opened up by this new genre for both creators and businessmen, because it was not only the home computer market that was caught up in the FMV craze. The entertainment industry in general, from giants like Sony to more modestly sized entities like Robert De Niro's Tribeca Interactive, saw artistic and financial opportunities in bridging the gap between cinema and silicon. By experiencing a story through video clips, with the player's choices triggering a different outcome each time, it seemed as if the notion of being in a movie, a fantasy that had been promised and unfulfilled for decades in both film and gaming, could perhaps be realised. And practically speaking, the idea seemed perfectly suited to an industry already partially fused to show business. Licensed TV or movie tie-ins were everywhere, and some publishers were subsidiaries of major entertainment companies like 20th Century Fox or Time Warner. The opportunity to promote licensed media with real, perhaps even reused, movie or television footage had obvious marketing potential, not to mention economic benefits. In 1994, for example, pitches for a licensed video game spin-off of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner were initially predicated on recycling footage from the original 1982 movie. But though the multimedia adventure might offer both creative and commercial opportunities, it was likely the latter that attracted the attention of Beam Software. Just as in the 1980s, Beam saw the industry moving towards something new, and were forced to adapt to the new paradigm. This time, however, Beam Software needn't be playing catch-up with their competitors. The company's senior research engineer, Adrian Thulis, had become particularly proficient in image and video processing, and was able to develop what Beam would refer to as their cinema technology, later trademarked as a VideoBeam. Marketed as offering, quote, full-screen TV quality video on an ordinary computer without the need for additional hardware, unquote, the The main advantage of VideoBeam was mitigating the limitations of video playback from compact disc, enabling weaker systems to play passably smooth and sharp footage from slow single-speed CD-ROMs. Considering Mist's success in penetrating the mainstream software market, precisely the kind of customers unlikely to own dedicated gaming or video processing hardware, VideoBeam offered the company the opportunity to target a broad range of consumers, nearly anyone who owned a home computer. And as Cyan and Trilobite had demonstrated, the surging FMV adventure genre could just as easily appeal to casual players as it could the traditional gaming demographic. Beam Software therefore began planning a new product line, a series of CD-ROM adventures that, thanks to their cinema technology, would allow users to experience live-action interactive blockbusters on their humble home computers. In a sense, the company that had hit it big with graphic adventures like The Hobbit or Sherlock was simply returning to its roots. Yet it was not 1984 anymore. Long gone were the days when a couple of programmers could knock out an 8-bit adventure and sell several 100,000 copies. If software houses wanted to compete with Hollywood, they needed the expertise and budget to match. A professionally produced adventure title required all sorts of specialized roles: dedicated producers, coders, designers, composers, audio engineers, and of course, a writer. The latter was a position in particular need of filling, as in 1994, Beam hadn't even been able to decide what their first FMV adventure was going to be about, let alone formulated a story or penned a script. Fortunately, at least 2 Beam staff were already familiar with an intrepid scribbler skilled in both storytelling and scenario building. The first employee, Darren Bremner, had in his wilder high school days become involved with the local Dungeons & Dragons club, where he came into contact with one Mark Morrison. Morrison was an obsessive tabletop player who had quickly progressed to designing his own adventures, and his passion for conceiving, narrating, and running D&D scenarios was not forgotten by Bremner. Though the two drifted apart upon entering university, in the mid-1980s Morrison's love for role-playing had led him, and then-girlfriend Penelope Love, to write professionally for Call of Cthulhu publisher Chaosium. Morrison and Love worked as writers, designers, and editors on several works, most notably the 1987 sourcebook Terra Australis, Cthulhu in the Land Down Under, and during their time at the company became acquainted with artist Gustav Bjorkson. By 1994, both Bjorkson and Darren Bremner were employed at Beam Software, and thus, when the company heads put out a call for writers, Morrison's name was put forward. Beam contacted Morrison and requested he pitch 5 possible scenarios for their adventure game, and Morrison acquiesced, or at least pretended to. In a 2022 interview with German gaming podcast Stay Forever, Morrison admitted that there was only one story he really wanted to write, a hard-boiled 1940s detective mystery he chose to title The Dame Was Loaded. Instead of offering 5 equally attractive propositions to Beam, Morrison therefore put Dame at the top of the list, and made the other 4 options sound as ridiculous as possible, so as to dissuade the company from picking any of them. The writer's sleight of hand was rewarded, and soon after signing on to the project, Morrison and the team were ready to move into production on their first full-motion video adventure, Episode 1 of the Scott Anger Detective series. Beam Software knew, of course, what type of game they were making before they went looking for a writer, so by the time Morrison was brought on, the team's programmers had already laid the foundations of the engine. The basics of the control scheme and interaction were in working order. What they lacked was the rest of the game. Finalizing Dame's script was therefore a priority. Morrison's original title was retained, as was the broad, Chandler-esque narrative of a compromised keyhole peeper becoming entangled with gangsters, police, and femme fatales. Although Morrison was responsible for the majority of the script, he asked Penny Love, herself a great admirer of detective fiction, to write the major female characters, whilst Beam's Craig Duterbuer also assisted, focusing primarily on the more humorous scenes and composing the game's theme song. According According to various sources, the project was assigned a budget of somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million Australian dollars, with an intended release date of Christmas 1995 and, according to Alfred Milgram, projected sales of around 400,000 copies. A significant proportion of those costs were being borne by outside sources. The most important of these was Philips Media, who would act as the game's publisher. Philips' interest in the project arose from the company's continuing attempts to resuscitate their struggling CDI device. Originally launched in 1991 as an all-in-one multimedia platform, by the mid-90s Philips were attempting to rebrand the latest models primarily as gaming consoles. Yet the machine's technical specifications and built-in CD-ROM ensured that it was best suited to exactly the sort of game Beam were designing, an interactive FMV adventure. In exchange for their support, Philips therefore expected the Dame Was Loaded to be ready to launch simultaneously on both home computer and the CDI. An additional source of funding, however, was the long-suffering Australian taxpayer. Though, as Beam were well aware, the country was not known as a leading light of the games industry, at the time of Dame's development there were plans to change that. In 1994, the Keating regime had embarked on its so-called Creative Nation initiative, which, among various other changes, promised increased funding for the arts. In the case of interactive media, distributed through the Australian Multimedia Enterprise, or AME. That the Dame Was Loaded was an unprecedented homegrown multimedia project was no doubt instrumental in securing a small sliver of public money, as was perhaps the fact that Beam's chairman sat on the AME's advisory board, though the exact details of how much funding Beam received from the public and which body provided it is unclear. A Variety article of the day implies Dame was receiving AME money directly, though Mark Morrison, speaking in 2025, was unsure, recalling a smaller grant from the state of Victoria, but suggesting in total the project may have received up to $250,000 in grants. Even so, the $750,000 figure cited in the Variety article as Dame's budget was not an obscene sum for a live-action FMV adventure. 1991's Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective had reportedly cost ICOM Interactive $2 million, and ICOM's new owner, Viacom, lavished even greater sums on another live-action title, 1993's Dracula Unleashed. Alfred Milgram argued that by 1994, to develop a product for the international market, $500,000 was the absolute minimum just to get off the ground. And budgeting was complicated by the fact that Beam Software had no experience making FMV games, let alone scripting, casting, and shooting the footage for one. Dame's producer, David Giles, was a former special effects expert and one of the few team members with experience in TV or film, including helping build and almost drowning in the Bog of Eternal Stench on the set of the 1986 movie Labyrinth. But the company as a whole lacked the knowledge and infrastructure to produce their own celluloid content. Developers who were part of larger conglomerates, particularly in America, sometimes had the advantage of being able to turn to other entertainment subsidiaries of their parent corporation, as was the case with Sony ImageSoft's Johnny Mnemonic tie-in. But this was not an option for a small Australian studio like Beam Software. Unsure where to begin, Beam had consulted their own media lawyer for advice, who put them in contact with Vixen Films, a TV production company headed by director Joe Lane, who were contracted to create the live-action assets for the game. But by early 1995, outside Australia, the FMV craze had already been raging for nearly 2 full years. And if industry critics had been anxious about the trend in 1993, by 95 they were livid. A slew of CD adventures had hit shelves since Myst and Seventh Guest's releases, a good number of them of questionable quality. The term Myst clone was starting to become endemic to adventure reviews, as the novelty of live-action footage was slowly wearing off, and the shortcomings of the genre increasingly perceived as congenital. To some, FMV games were becoming synonymous with shallow, restrictive gameplay, soap opera production values, and washed-up movie stars, both of the silver screen and Skinemax. But what was worse, from the perspective of their detractors, was that despite their failings, there seemed no sign of the trend slowing down. In addition to those CD-ROM adventures already on the way, including Trilo Megabyte's long overdue sequel to Seventh Guest, many new titles were just entering development, such as a $6 million X-Files tie-in. Beam Software's contribution to the genre did not have 20th Century Fox and their money behind it, but in Vixen they did at least have the services of an experienced production company. Even so, for both Beam and Vixen, an interactive live-action adventure was virgin territory, as only a handful of team members, like David Giles, had any experience with cinema, and Vixen themselves were unfamiliar with the requirements of incorporating footage into a home computer title. Giles took Mark Morrison's script to Vixen producer Stuart Menzies, who considered the number of actors, props, costumes, and environments involved, and came back with a rough estimate for the shooting costs. Whatever the figure was, it was far too rich for Alfred Milgram to stomach, and Giles was sent back to Morrison with instructions to cut the script by around a third. Although initially upset, as the requirement meant the loss of various side characters and subplots, Morrison stated in his 2022 interview that the change was for the better, as Dame's original design was unnecessarily bloated. The narrative was rewritten to accommodate the budget, as well as neatly fit onto 2 separate CDs, and finally cleared with both Vixen and Beam's upper management. There were still considerable risks remaining, however. To spare the costs of renting a studio and building full-scale sets from scratch, Dame was assigned around 3 weeks of principal photography to be shot on location at various locations around Melbourne. Beyond this short window, any additional filming would be prohibitively expensive, or even completely infeasible for anything other than environmental footage. To reduce the likelihood of costly reshoots, the game had to be fully playtested before Vixen began filming. To do so, Morrison drew from his experience with Dungeons & Dragons and Call of Cthulhu by playing the script as a sort of quasi-tabletop scenario, with the participants limited to a specific set of items and options. This step helped the team identify any possible errors or oversights in both the narrative and the gameplay before they disrupted filming. Beam's artists could then convert the script into storyboards, which could in turn be utilised for a prototype build of the game. This version of Dame followed what it was assumed would be the final narrative and quest structure, using placeholder graphics and dialogue recorded by Beam staff, and allowed the company's designers and QA department to begin playtesting. At the same time, over at Vixen, Joe Lane and Stuart Menzies oversaw the shooting of pre-production test footage, and learned of the limitations of filming for home computers. VideoBeam might have permitted higher quality footage than was typical for CD-ROMs, but it was still primitive compared to real film. The process of converting and compressing video to CD-ROM specifications introduced a variety of serious artifacts that potentially rendered the footage unusable, meaning Vixen had to account for everything from the colour of lipstick to the complexity of patterns on a dress. And the process would likely be equally challenging for the cast, as the performers involved would have to unlearn the most basic lesson of TV acting, to not speak directly into the camera lens. The game's stars would also have to adjust to being filmed from a much shorter distance than was typical, and due to the first-person perspective, whoever was to play the protagonist would find themselves in an uncomfortably intimate relationship with the cameramen. Despite these challenges, filming was scheduled to go ahead around spring 1995, and Dame's cast were gathered together for the shoot. The majority of the leads were at the time minor TV actors, coming primarily from popular Australian daytime dramas like Neighbours or Home and Away, though one or two of the older performers were also known in the country for their movie roles, such as Crocodile Dundee 2 henchman Gus Mercurio. Both Mark Morrison and David Giles would spend a significant amount of time on set, with Morrison sometimes rewriting scenes and consulting with the actors, who were often delivering their lines out of context. Despite the extensive pre-production process that had taken place, the fact that the project was treading new ground for almost everyone involved meant there were still some disruptions to filming, and Morrison recalls several instances of the cast being forced to sit down and do nothing for long periods, whilst technical or practical difficulties were ironed out. Even so, whatever catastrophes might have occurred during the shoot failed to materialise. Actress Terry Waddell, for example, recalls the shoot being, quote, lovely and hilarious, unquote. By mid-1995, filming was completed, and mentions of The Dame Was Loaded began to appear in gaming magazines. Generally described as a fully interactive FMV adventure, the semi-non-linear gameplay and multiple endings were sometimes mentioned, but most coverage repeated press releases emphasizing the number of actors and locations, the amount of voice dialogue and live-action footage included, and naturally how Beam's patented cinema technology, which they hoped to license to third parties, made the game accessible to a wider audience. Mark Morrison and other team members also promoted Dame at various Australian arts and culture conferences. Both a non-interactive showcase and later in the year a playable demo were released. On the whole, however, The Dame Was Loaded was not yet being heavily promoted, probably due to two major factors. For one, the game's intended release date of Christmas 1995 was only for Australia. A likely more lucrative international launch was not scheduled until the first quarter of 1996. For another, Dame's initial launch looked as if it would be missing an important component: the CDI version. Philips may have been pouring cash into both first and third-party titles for their struggling device, but there was little sign of their efforts paying off. In multi-platform publications, there was a hushed and not-so-hushed consensus that it was too late for the company to change course. In some regions, the CDI was still regarded as primarily a vehicle for pornographic materials, and where it had been successfully marketed as a gaming machine, it was facing down the imminent international release of next-generation CD-equipped consoles like the Sony PlayStation. And in the niche of FMV games, Philips were now competing with the similarly embattled 3DO console. Among CDI fan communities, there was a pervasive sense of defeatism. Dame was brought up as one of many promised FMV titles that had been scheduled for a 1995 release on the device, yet would clearly fail to arrive on time. The PC version's Australian release in November of that year was therefore both a quiet and a lonely one.
Media Games and Beam Software present The Dame Was Loaded.
In a town like this, full of dark alleys, twisted secrets, and dangerous desires, a new case is always just around the corner.
I don't know where he is. He did say he'd met a girl.
Maybe they eloped. But her money's good, and that buys 3 days of your time.
Dame was not completely lacking in marketing. An Australian TV news crew had visited the studio, and the company were also trying to take advantage of what seemed to be the future of video game marketing, multimedia and online advertising. Beam Software published their own video game magazine, The Disc, which was unique in being a gaming mag that had no print edition, and existed solely as a CD-ROM and website. But coverage of Dame in late 1995 was extremely limited. According to Mark Morrison, even in Australia, retailers turned their nose up at the game, partly due to being an FMV title, and partly due to a phenomenon in Australia dubbed cultural cringe, a perception among Australians that domestically produced media was inferior to international content. Morrison recalls that at the time, the only game Australian retailers seemed to care about was Delphin Software's 3D action-adventure Fade to Black. In addition, Dame shipped too late in the year for most reviewers to cover or promote it in their Christmas issues, leaving commentators in online news groups somewhat surprised by its appearance on retail shelves. Some international players were nevertheless able to acquire copies, such as Humongous Entertainment's Dave Timoney, who would later write one of the only walkthroughs available for the game. What little feedback from 1995 can be found appears to have been mixed, with one Australian player stating that the game felt too similar to Access Software's Tex Murphy adventures, a criticism that would resurface several times after its release. It was not until the new year that mainstream reviews of Dame began appearing, most notably that of Australia's Hyper, which was generally positive. But as winter passed to spring and the game's international release approached, Philips Media's marketing machine spluttered to life. Dame was promoted at the European Computer Trade Show, full-page advertisements began appearing in British, American and European gaming magazines, and previews of the game managed to garner more than the sentence or two it was afforded by journalists in the previous year. The UK's official CDI magazine was particularly enthusiastic in covering Dame, perhaps taking up the slack for its USA edition, which had already been discontinued, and would, from spring onwards, consistently report that the game's CD CDI version was imminent. This turned out to be untrue, though Dame's international launch for home computers did indeed materialise, at least in the case of Windows PCs. But the critical response was not a remarkably positive one. Most big-name publications, from Computer Gaming World to PC Gamer to Next Generation, hardly paid much attention in the first place, typically reserving only a sliver of space towards the back of each respective magazine for their reviews. The reason for this lack of interest was the unavoidable reality that Beam Software were releasing a live-action FMV title at a time when the majority of reviewers were already choking on the genre. Just as was true of the previous year, 1996 was inundated with CD-ROM adventure games. The month of Dame's release, most magazines were reviewing, on average, half a dozen titles of a similar nature, often with, from a casual player's perspective, very similar gameplay mechanics. And even within the specific niche Beam Software were targeting, a hard-boiled detective story, consumers were spoilt for choice. Philips were marketing Dame as, quote, the world's first fully interactive film noir detective adventure game, unquote. But the claim was a rather dubious one. Gamers with a predilection for Sam Spade and his ilk could flick through the same issue in which The Dame Was Loaded was reviewed and encounter advertisements for Brooklyn Interactive's Philip Marlowe Private Eye, Access Software's upcoming The Pandora Directive, Take-Two's Ripper, and various other noir or neo-noir adventure titles, some of which were being much more heavily marketed than Beam's humble offering. And Ripper in particular, having reportedly cost Take-Two over $4 million, was also a reminder that though Beam had once thought their cinema technology and relationship with Vixen would elevate them above their rivals, neither technology nor ballooning development costs had slowed since 1994. Some rival FMV games featured either bigger budget production values, or better video compression techniques, or perhaps even both. In short, by the time The Dame Was Loaded hit shelves in America and other important markets, it seemed to many a title indistinguishable from most other CD-ROM adventures, recycling a well-liked but also well-worn premise, and playing back live-action footage of an artistic and technical quality that was, fairly or not, perceived as, at best, merely equal to its leading competitors. Thus, the notion that Dame was a tired cliché of both overused and unremarkable tropes in gameplay, writing, and presentation was widely, though not unanimously, held by the majority of English-language reviewers. Typical review scores drifted somewhere between the 50 to 70% range, not particularly helpful to the game when its contemporaries, like Pandora or Ripper, were scoring at least 20 to 30% higher. Many of the complaints directed at Dame were the same as those that had dogged the FMV adventure since 1993. Limited interactivity, sluggish scene transitions and navigation, and, according to some reviewers, amateurish production values, a charge that would no doubt have been particularly stinging to Jo Lane and her crew. Worse, although there was some praise for the semi-non-linear narrative, various gameplay mechanics unique or mostly unique to Dame came in for heavy criticism. The game's time limit was especially disliked, whilst many reviewers were also frustrated by inventory restrictions, the fixed save system, and the tedium of daily routines like shaving and sleeping. Computer Gaming World's Charles Ardai would speak for many critics in describing Dame as a combination of, quote, bad writing, bad acting, and bad game design, unquote. And though European reviewers were usually more sympathetic, even in the old world, some popular magazines trashed the title with sub-mediocre scores. Although specific sales figures are not available, statements by Mark Morrison suggest that The Dame Was Loaded almost certainly failed to meet Alfred Milgram's earlier prediction of 300 to 400,000 copies. Even so, Philips remained insistent that the game's CDI launch was just around the corner, with CDI magazine repeatedly promising a review right up until its discontinuation in autumn 1996. According to an email exchange conducted between a CDI fan site and former Beam and Vixen staff in 2007, this version of the game was fully or almost fully completed, but cancelled by Philips Media just before going gold. Mark Morrison, for his part, states diplomatically that Beam met their obligations to Philips in this regard. and according to Morrison, a Macintosh port of Dame was fully completed, but at the time did not receive a formal release, and was only distributed among a small number of Apple users. This last-minute discontinuation of the CDI and Macintosh versions of Dame was not a coincidence. By 1996, Philips had, internally, determined that their attempts to remarket the CDI as a gaming device had not borne fruit, and were instead promoting it to business users as a tool for training and multimedia presentations. The company began winding down support for its gaming and edutainment divisions, and Beam Software were one of many developers affected. Although Beam had begun the early stages of work on a second Scott Anger mystery, with Mark Morrison stating that he had completed the script for the sequel, Philips' withdrawal from the game's development scene put an end to this project. The loss of support from Philips was not the end of Beam Software. Their 1997 RTS Crush, Kill and Destroy, which also made use of VideoBeam, was well received, and unlike Dame, led to an updated re-release and a sequel, KKND 2, the following year. But due to financial issues, the company was sold to French publishing titan Infogrames in 1999, whereupon it was rebranded as Infogrames Melbourne House. Several members of the team that had worked on Dame remained at the studio, soon rebranded as Atari Melbourne House, until the late 2000s, when it was again sold off and subsequently shut down. Despite its low-profile release and lukewarm reception in 1996, in the decades that followed, The Dame Was Loaded would not be entirely forgotten by either the gaming industry or detective fans, as although Dame was launched in the midst of a backlash against FMV games, the CD-ROM adventure would endure for at least another 2 years. Both point-and-click and detective titles continued hitting the shelves throughout the mid to late 90s, occasionally inspiring reviewers to recall Beam's game. When the hard-boiled adventure title Noir, a shadowy thriller, arrived in Australia in 1997, for example, PC Powerplay's David Wildgoose complained that it wasn't as good as Dame. And even as the industry entered the 2000s and beyond, Scott Anger would stubbornly refuse to fade back into the shadows. In 2001, Computer Gaming World's Charles R. Dye cited Dame as one of the 11 strangest titles he'd reviewed since joining the magazine in 1986. Whilst almost 20 years after R. Dye recalled the game, PC Gamer would characterise it as both deeply flawed, but also one of the few FMV titles of the era worth playing. The game would also appear in historical and educational material published over the years, such as several books covering the history of the noir and hard-boiled detective genres, and, most curiously, an academic textbook from the UK, in which, due to Dame's setting and story, it was used as a case study for students to discuss the merits of governments funding media that was rooted in a different country's history and culture. In Australia, however, there seem no such doubts as to the game's Aussian heritage. Dame is sometimes mentioned in histories of the country's arts and software scene as an early pioneer in interactive media, and is included in collections at the Australian Museum of Moving Images in Melbourne. Fittingly, Mark Morrison and Penelope Love followed in the footsteps of Marlowe and Loring by tying the knot in 2009, and remember their own detective story with great fondness, untroubled by its failure to match the success of the Tex Murphy franchise. By 2018, The Dame Was Loaded was once again available for purchase, courtesy of online retailers such as Good Old Games, though in an unfortunate echo of its original release, both there and on Steam, complaints resurfaced regarding the game's time limit, interface, inventory, blurry movie footage, and cheesy acting. And so, our journey through Dame's history might be over, but for those of you interested in the final product, skin, guts, bones and all, we've plenty to cover. Gameplay, of course, is supposed to come first, so before passing judgment on anything, let's start up the GOG release and get a sense of how it plays.
Tell me about Dan Small.
That's a funny question for a musician.
I'm a funny musician.
Well, then you're sure to get a laugh out of this.
No matter how tough you are, there's always somebody tougher.
Dame opens with a cutscene in which the player, as Los Angeles private detective Scott Anger, talks business with a Miss Carol Klein of Oregon. Carol's brother, Dan Klein, moved to Los Angeles some time ago, but the family have lost contact with him and are worried about his safety, requesting the Anger and Spencer Detective Agency track him down. Anger accepts the case, taking a retainer and a photo of Dan, and promises to find him. After Carol leaves, however, the other half of the agency, Ralph Spencer, warns Anger that he can only spare 3 days for the investigation, as on August 1st, Anger is needed in New York on another job. Control is then handed over to the player and the game begins. Though they have little time to spare, it's a good idea for players to orient themselves before they leave, as there are several useful items in the office, and they'll be returning here many times throughout the game. Like most first-person graphic adventures of its type, Dame is divided into hundreds of static screens, with a single in-game location, like the PI office, made up of anywhere from 3 or 4 to a dozen interconnected shots. The detective agency, for example, consists of a screen facing the front door from Anger's desk, another facing Ralph's desk and the back entrance, a reverse shot facing Anger's desk from the front door, a scene of the alleyway adjacent to the office, and some sub-screens in which the player is more closely inspecting certain parts of the room. Within an individual scene, the mouse is used to highlight interactable objects, and the cursor will change depending on the options available. The left mouse button is for actions, whether that be inspecting an area of the screen more closely, activating something, speaking to NPCs, or picking up items, whilst the right mouse button prompts Anger to comment on the object. Arrayed in front of Anger at the start of the game, for example, is a photograph of his murdered lover, as well as a camera, a pen, and a typewriter, which is for manually saving progress. If Anger picks up an item, it's classed as being held, and can be applied to other objects in the environment. To simply pocket the item, the player will need to hold down both mouse buttons to open their inventory, and then drop the item in the list. Anger's pockets are not bottomless, however, so the player may wish to deposit an item in a container, such as the drawer atop the office desk. Exploring the room, Anger will find a few other points of interest. His somnolent partner, Ralph, will occasionally offer Anger some advice, or, if it's not too much trouble, some form of assistance that does not involve leaving his chair. The most important tip Ralph gives Anger at the start of the game is to remind him once again of the time limit. In The Dame Was Loaded, time never sleeps. Even as the player stands here in his office, the minutes are ticking away. Anger can check his watch from his inventory, fast-forwarding if necessary, and a calendar on the wall reminds him of the date. But when the player attempts to leave the office by the front door, they'll be introduced to yet another time-related pressure. Anger and his partner have not been keeping up on the rent, and their landlord demands his due. Money can be selected from the inventory, and can be an important resource in the game, as Anger has the usual daily living expenses, whilst various lowlifes will happily feed him some information in exchange for a fin or more. Unfortunately, Anger doesn't have enough money to pay what the landlord is owed, and is warned that if he doesn't have the dough on him within 7 days, he and his partner are out on the street. Of course, from the player's perspective, this is of no consequence, as their role in the Klein case will be done after 3 days. Or will it? Either way, Anger is already against the clock, so it's time to hop in the Pontiac and start the investigation. The car has a couple of important, and not so important, features. The former being, firstly, extra storage space via the trunk, and secondly, the map in the glove compartment, which lets the player pick their next destination. In Dame, the City of Angels is divided into 3 segments on the map, though only the first, closest to the office, is relevant right now, showing the local police station, the newspaper office, the diner, and Anger's favourite barber. Travelling by car obviously takes up a fair chunk of daylight, so picking where to go can by itself have consequences for the player. Considering the fact Anger is looking for a missing person, the logical place to start would be either the police station or the paper, but since the game world operates on a day and night cycle, neither location is worth visiting at this early hour. That leaves the barber and the diner. Anger's barber is worth visiting because even a down-and-out private dick needs to keep up appearances. The inhabitants of 1940s Los Angeles will not react positively to a man who looks like a vagrant, or an agitator. And although the barber will be irritated if the player tries plying the PI trade with him, whilst working he will periodically let slip some local gossip, or if Anger has read the paper, comment on the latest news. Unfortunately, the proprietor of the local diner is even less forthcoming as a source of information, but this isn't to say Anger won't find anything of use there. If the player orders coffee and donuts, for example, they can take the second donut to go, whilst a more traditional meal will furnish them with a knife and fork, which can also be pocketed. By the time Anger is done with his morning routine, at least one of the other locations should be available. At the local police station, Anger has an ally in Officer Denton, who is the first major source of information in the game. When interacting with NPCs, the player can go through a list of people or topics they've been made aware of, or they can select an item from their inventory and show or give it to the NPC. Showing a photo of Dan Klein to Denton, for example, reveals that in Los Angeles, Klein went by a different name. But Officer Denton is also an example of how the player should be careful of their words and actions around NPCs. Denton may be a friend to Anger, but he's also a veteran of the Force and a stickler for law and order. He may become angry if the PI pokes his nose into police business, such as interrogating the officer on the status of his dead lover's case, going so far as to temporarily eject Anger from the premises if he does it repeatedly. Similarly, if the player shows Denton an item that might be considered evidence of a crime, Denton may insist on seizing it for forensic analysis, the results of which he'll share later on, but this will of course likely mean the permanent loss of that item. The police station is therefore a valuable source of information, whether acquired directly or otherwise, but not where Anger wants to be when acting outside the law. A slightly less scrupulous asset can be found at the offices of the Los Angeles Tribune. Here, Anger can speak to an old tomato, star reporter Francine Henderson, who, though still a little sore at Anger for stepping out on her, still likes him enough to answer a question or two, and perhaps more importantly, extend him access to the Tribune's morgue, a repository of the paper's coverage going back several years. Unfortunately, Dan Klein appears to have been true to his name, as neither the police nor the papers have recorded much information about him, other than that he moved in less than reputable circles. That means that in order to continue his investigation, Anger will have to turn to Los Angeles' criminal underworld. A well-known haunt for bit players in the business of iniquity is Jake's Joint, a nighttime cubbyhole for boozers and small-time gamblers hidden down a dark alleyway. Jake is understandably resistant to letting PIs into his place of work, especially alcoholic ones, prone to playing at target practice when they're soused. So Anger will need some means of persuading Jake to allow him access. Once inside, the player can try interrogating Jake, who is not likely to be loose-lipped about his clientele, or he can head to his usual table. At the table are three of Anger's old acquaintances, low-level lawbreakers of varying temperament, who are willing to take a question in exchange for a game of poker. Anger can ask a question even if he loses, so he'll be needing to try his luck either way, but players confident in their skills as card sharks may also find this minigame a good source of extra revenue, considering Anger's tight finances. From the trio of gangsters, Anger can learn that Dan Klein has not been seen in a while, but was known to associate with a better-known figure in the underworld, one Frederick Creel. By the time the player has acquired all this information, it'll probably be around Anger's bedtime. Players cannot ignore fatigue in Dame. After staying awake for long enough, Anger will comment that he is feeling tired, and if the player ignores this warning several times, the next time they try to drive, they'll end up in a car crash and an automatic game over. Outside of scripted sequences, the only location in which the player can sleep is a couch in Anger's office, so after a hard day's work, that's where they'll probably be headed. By the second day of the case, Anger should have gathered enough information to make inquiries into their only lifeline, the mysterious Freddie Creel. Through various means, Anger discovers that Creel is anything but a lifeline, however, as the mobster has been murdered, squashed in a crusher at the local foundry. Fortunately, the murder opens up several more avenues of investigation for Anger. First, there may be some evidence related to the case left behind at the foundry in which Creel was compacted. Second, his alleged killer is currently a guest of the Los Angeles penitentiary system. And third, Creel left behind a widow, Louise, who is still living in the city. The Foundry is an example of one of Dame's more traditionalist puzzles. Anger can inspect the crusher in which Creel died and spot something beneath it. The gap beneath the machine is too narrow for a man's hand to reach, however, so some tool long and flat enough to grab the mysterious object is required. The Foundry is also an early illustration of the game's semi-non-linearity. If the player arrived early enough, they'll also have cause to play around with a suspicious forklift, but visiting the Foundry later results in relevant material having been moved to the police station. As for the jail, Anger won't be doing anything technical. Instead, he'll mostly be jawing with Creel's alleged murderer, but the suspect won't open up unless given some incentive to do so. And the Creel residence is a more difficult section than the other two, a mix of timed puzzles and NPC interaction, probably requiring more than one visit to complete successfully. Assuming he's presentable, when Anger arrives, he'll initially find Louise Creel to be an accommodating host, politely answering most of his questions so long as he doesn't bore her too much or offend her, but it's clear the woman is either unaware or unwilling to go into all the details of her husband's dishonest work. The grieving widow can be prodded into leaving the room to fetch something to drink, but not for long enough to fully inspect the living room. Being caught or angering Louise will get the player kicked out at gunpoint. Anger needs to find an opportunity to rummage through the Creel residence without being watched, meaning he needs to either find a way of making Miss Creel leave the room for a lengthy period the next time he visits her, or needs to break into the residence when she's not there. By chasing up on these angles, Creel's home, the murder scene, and the supposed killer, Anger discovers that Freddie Creel was somehow involved in a recent heist, the spoils of which are still missing. With barely a day left on the clock, players will have to pursue several further leads, such as a motel, a mysterious locker at the rail station, and a rival PI's office, in order to establish how Dan Klein ties into any of this. Thus, assuming Anger makes it to the last day of the investigation without being killed or tossed in jail, there are two possible outcomes. One is that Anger, now needed in New York, passes the job to Ralph Spencer and heads to the Big Apple, which of course ends the game. Or he progresses far enough into the investigation that a third party takes a sudden interest in him, and Anger spends the final day of the countdown fighting for his life. At this point, the game will move to the second disc, essentially Act 2 of the narrative. The player will be relieved of having to concern themselves with the original time limit, but will, in addition to investigating the Klein job, be saddled with a second countdown, not as short as the first, but involving a more complex case. For the rest of the game, the player will thus be following the same formula as they did for the first 3 days, but featuring much more complex puzzles that require visiting new areas like a laundromat, a nightclub, and an upscale hotel. Successfully completing these puzzles requires being in the right place at the right time, wearing the right clothes and the right face, having the right items at hand, or, in some cases, not having them at hand. Depending on how they conduct themselves, the player can easily miss certain facts or items of evidence, meaning that, putting aside various fail states, the game can end in several different ways, ranging from which characters end up facing justice, to what inconvenient truths about the Klein case are dredged up, to whether Anger ends up with a dame or not. Either way, players are unlikely to get the best outcome, or a particularly good outcome at all, on their first playthrough, so the game encourages players to restart, and see if they can find a better way to do things the second, third, or maybe even the fourth time around, and hopefully see an end screen that doesn't read, "Game over." It's tempting to imagine that, long before copies of The Dame Was Loaded were sent out to gaming magazines in 1996, many writers already had their reviews ready to go. You could sift through some texts relating to Dame and easily swap entire paragraphs out with those from reviews of any old FMV adventure of the day. Complaints of linearity, unintuitive navigation around and between scenes, awkward interaction, outdated mechanics, and in a general sense, shallow gameplay that served as an unconvincing excuse for selling a low-budget movie at an inflated price. One exception to this trend worth pointing out was Australia's Hyper magazine, which claimed to have been shocked by the twin facts that first, Dame wasn't as linear as they expected, and second, that it was more gameplay oriented than its rivals. We could discount Hyper's review as paid content, or merely an outburst of nationalistic pride in a homegrown adventure. At the time of release, Aussie and Newsgroup posters joked that they felt compelled to support the game in the interests of patriotism, but there were several non-Australian magazines that defended the game, who, like Hyper, assured readers The Dame Was Loaded was not another one of those dreadful interactive clip compilations. But note here how even the game's supporters contextualise Dame as an FMV title arriving amidst an avalanche of anti-FMV sentiment. Fans will cite this as evidence that the Dame was mistreated by reviewers, that it neatly slotted into the pre-existing narrative of all FMV games being bad movies, hung on the skeletal framework of a simplistic, static screen point-and-click adventure, a glorified multimedia choose-your-own-adventure or hidden object hunt, more at home in an overfunded museum exhibit, and that Dame's depth and unique charms were unfairly passed over by lazy reviewers with a deadline to meet. But did Dame really have any depth to it? And just how charming were those elements that were not present in typical FMV adventures? There are certain shortcomings to the game that don't really need to be viewed in any particular context. The interface and controls are, by general consensus, not the worst in the genre, but not particularly intuitive either. The idea of dumping a table of verb-based commands and simply having the left button automatically perform the appropriate action is understandable for a streamlined graphic adventure, but can be annoying when anger performs an action you might not expect. More troubling is the way the inventory and holding system works, having to pick up and hold an item, then double-click to open the inventory, then drag the item to the appropriate section of the inventory without misclicking or hovering the cursor over the wrong area of the screen, a slightly overcomplicated system for a game that includes several life and death timed sections. It's especially fiddly when trying to store items in containers like the car trunk, which uses its own strange little system. The fixed office typewriter save system was also the subject of griping, as was having only a handful of save slots. Some reviewers suggested this was a limitation of the game being designed for the CDI console, though I'm fairly certain it was intentional. Those problems don't need to be viewed in relation to other games or trends of the day. Many players disliked them then, and they dislike them now. But there is a lot of what was contentious about The Dame Was Loaded that is best considered in the context of the time and where Dame stood in relation to its investigative adventure peers. Was it fair for so many critics of the 90s to hammer it for being a mere interactive movie? In terms of basic gameplay mechanics, let's think about where Beam's stab at the genre landed on the graphic adventure to visual novel scale. Contemporaneously, a clear example of the former would be a title like Ripper, which was filled with all sorts of gamey activities like jigsaws, memory tests, and shooting galleries, or, at that time around a year old but still mentioned by reviewers, the third entry in the Tex Murphy series, Under a Killing Moon, which dropped the player in a semi-open 3D world, told them to go find some detective work, and then mostly left them to their own devices. Leaning more towards the much maligned VN would be, say, 1995's Johnny Mnemonic, which Next Generation mentioned in their review of Dame, but we have more pertinent examples from 1996, like Philip Marlowe, Private Eye, or Noir, a shadowy thriller, as the latter two are, like Beam's game, meant to be detective mysteries, and were heavily criticised by some reviews for being too shallow or linear. As we've observed, opinions were divided as to where The Dame Was Loaded fell in relation to these. PC Review thought it did a better job balancing video and gameplay than its competitors, whereas detractors like PC Zone and Power Unlimited positioned it squarely in the cinematic adventure camp. As a cowardly, indecisive ignoramus, I shall adopt the role of moderate by placing Dame somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. It's not as conventionally puzzle or interaction heavy as some point-and-click adventures, but certainly not an interactive movie in the derogatory sense of the term either. There's no doubt that building the entire game around live-action footage and on-set photography limited Beam's options. Mark Morrison mentioned in his Stay Forever interview that during development development, he was furiously scribbling down extra lines or making amendments to the script right up to the same day as the scenes were supposed to be shot, a practice that quite understandably was discontinued after complaints from the actor and producer. Once filming was over, there was only so much that could be shifted around or modified by photoshopping and recuts. In the final game, Scott Anger's range of options for engaging with the world are not quite as extensive as those available to the protagonists of a classic Sierra or LucasArts adventure. In the static environments, the player can only interact or look at objects, and when speaking there's a limit to the available topics of conversation. But you're not mindlessly clicking everything on the screen. Some items are dangerous to operate or will land you in trouble if found in your possession, firearms being an obvious example. Anger is no Mike Hammer, and depending on the circumstances may be arrested or have his license suspended if the Tin Men find him rodded. Even walking into the wrong room or abusing someone's hospitality can have consequences. In terms of environmental interaction, that would, in theory, have put Dame ahead of something like Ripper, which didn't really allow players to really interfere with the props in each scene, let alone put much thought into whether they should touch or pick things up in the first place. And though standard conversational topics in Dame are limited to preset options, the player can also try applying items to NPCs, which again can end badly if they just randomly click everything in Anger's inventory. Titles like Ripper or Noir only let you use something on a character when the developers permitted it. Finally, it's also up to the player which locations to visit, and when. Compared to Private Eye, for example, you have access to more areas in the early game, and you aren't mostly following instructions to go from A to B to C and such, as quickly becomes apparent in Noir, where uncovering a clue can block out an earlier location and automatically replace a travel point so it heads to the new, previously inaccessible area. So why was it that reviewers in 1996 were almost equally divided on the question of whether Dame was merely an interactive movie or not? There's a few possible reasons, the first of which is especially relevant to the era in which it was released. Ripper was able to assert that it was a game and not a visual novel because, like many first-person adventures in the vein of Myst, it relied on a variety of somewhat arbitrary mini-games. There's no logical basis for a title about being an investigative reporter to involve putting crystals in the right order, or playing battle chess with orcs and elves, or shooting cyber monsters in VR. But that was the custom of the day. A first-person adventure game meant side activities like puzzles, and Ripper was replete with those. The Dame Was Loaded isn't as overtly gamified as something like Ripper. It doesn't really have those kinds of puzzles or side activities, with the exception of the poker minigame, which you may only use once or twice. Gameplay is about visiting locations in the right order, choosing the right dialogue or items and so on, similar to Noir or Private Eye. Those two titles, and Dame to a slightly lesser degree, were criticised at the time for not being gamey enough because, unlike Ripper, their gameplay mechanics were not recognised as being such. They veered too close to interactive slideshows or FMV compilations. As we've seen, in terms of something like environmental interactivity, Dame or Private Eye are actually less cinematic than Ripper, but that interaction is not really on the same level as the formal puzzles and action sequences found in the Cyberpunk game. Another facet to this game versus visual novel debate that Dame and PI brush up against is the question of whether a non-linear narrative constitutes gameplay or not. Ripper, Dame, and Private Eye were all heavily promoted for featuring alternative routes or outcomes to their stories, and we'll obviously discuss that later in this video, but it's worth distinguishing between how reviewers perceived narrative-driven adventures at the time versus how they're taken today. By 1996, adventure games that leaned on a player's ability to navigate dialogue and narrative were generally seen in a negative light by gaming magazines. They were interactive movies aimed at a casual audience, the kind of people who were brought in by Myst and didn't even like real games. That Dame allowed some degree of agency in determining how its story played out was not seen as enhancing its interactivity. It was an element of the narrative, not the gameplay. If we jump forward 15 to 20 years though, the narrative adventure had something of a revival, the Telltale titles and so on, and mainstream reviewers were far more open to these games than they had been in the mid-90s. These sorts of experiences, interactive narrative adventures, walking simulators, or whatever we dub them, were and are criticised on the same grounds as the FMV games of earlier eras, that they're barely games at all. But unlike in the 90s, there are plenty of modern commentators avowing their legitimacy and value to the genre. Unfortunately for Beam Software, The Dame Was Loaded arrived more than a decade too early to benefit from such enlightened voices. Ripper didn't have this problem. Whatever else it was undoubtedly a game. But Dame probably suffered because it portrayed detective work as, in part, asking the right or wrong questions and experiencing the consequences further down the line. As with Private Eye, in the view of several reviewers, that made it less of a game. It's an interesting topic because it raises the issue of how The Dame Was Loaded, Private Eye, Noir, and Under a Killing Moon all tried to represent the detective experience in their gameplay, rather than only copying standard adventure mechanics, and some were more successful or given more credit for it than others. In Dame's case, simulating the life of a fictional PI involved not only tracking down witnesses and grilling possible suspects, but also juggling mundanities like sleeping and shaving, all the while mindful of a fairly aggressive time limit, at least in the first half of the game. Whilst a minority of players enjoyed this approach, the Stay Forever podcaster interviewing Morrison, for example, or a handful of reviewers, I don't think I'm overstating when I say that, by and large, it wasn't received well. We've already touched on why in the mid-90s Dame's gameplay seemed out of step with contemporary tastes, but as Morrison himself admitted, the game's more recent relaunch on Steam and GOG hasn't garnered a whole lot of positive reviews either. So aside from controls, what is it that bothered players, both in the 90s and the 2010s onwards? The most obvious issue is just how unforgiving the game could be in prosecuting players who failed to keep up with their daily routines. Forget to shave and you'll be turned away from important locations. Forget to sleep and you'll die. One puzzle requires performing a whole host of seemingly irrelevant actions in a specific order, from shaving to preparing fake facial hair to cleaning a suit to mending the suit to remembering to wear the suit. That in itself, performing arbitrary or mundane tasks to progress, isn't especially unusual in adventure games. PC Gamer's retro review of Dame pointed out this challenge was reminiscent of Gabriel Knight's notorious moustache puzzle, and Morrison mentioned that he'd grown up with the Monkey Island games, which consciously plumbed the depths of absurdism. What is unusual is making them part of what I suppose you'd call the core gameplay loop. Eating, sleeping, or grooming oneself might be part of self-contained puzzles in many adventures, but not activities you're meant to partake of regularly. It seems a bizarre addition to the standard Myst formula, but again, keep in mind that Beam's intent was to make Dame as immersive as they could within the boundaries of adventure gameplay. The classic PI, the Continental Operative, Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, and even the hard-charging Mike Hammer do in many of their stories spend a substantial amount of time hanging around bars, showering, buying smokes or groceries and so on. Time sometimes spent productively, oft times wasted. There are plenty of passages involving the PI waiting half the night outside a dingy hotel or a clandestine meeting point, only to return home no wiser than before. But of course, reading a few sentences about Marlowe frittering away his evening isn't as annoying as doing it yourself, nor Mike Hammer forgetting his shoulder holster as infuriating as hitting the inventory limit and having to go back to your car to fiddle with the storage menu. And I can only assume whoever came up with the idea of randomly depriving you of access to all the items in your storage containers halfway through the game was going through a messy divorce. Combine all that with some activities cancelling others out, sleeping causing issues like cosmetics being smeared away, or disguises falling off, and you have a recipe for frustration. Still, is that really so much worse than the standard adventure headache of jumping back and forth between locations, trying to figure out which pixel you forgot to click, or dialogue option you missed, wondering whether one switch in one location was meant to be flipped before or after a second switch in a completely different location? Maybe not, and I can see the intent from an immersion standpoint of making you feel like a hapless, down-on-your-luck private dick, probably more used to chasing down late insurance payments than tangling with spies and assassins. But then, that aspect of the hard-boiled PI life, standing on street corners for hours or drifting past seedy establishments in the hope of a lucky break, seems more suited to an open-world, GTA-esque game, something like Neo-Noir, not a puzzle-driven adventure. There is certainly something to be said for a more structured design in capturing both the sense of a living world and simulating the innumerable angles from which Hammett, Chandler, or Spillane's heroes had to attack a case before getting anywhere. Just as fictional detectives often arrived too late to a crime scene, got sapped and lost a piece of evidence, or bungled an interrogation, so does anger sometimes have the opportunity to salvage an investigation by stumbling upon an alternative route. It is unusual to play an adventure game in which both the player's actions and the in-game timer can cause witnesses to move around, flee, or end up permanently silenced, or make key items appear and disappear at different locations. Or at least it was in the 90s. Beam's earliest titles, though as far as I know not a direct influence on Dame, had themselves been progressing towards this living world style of adventure design, with Sherlock featuring a working railway timetable, NPCs moving back and forth between scenes, and a police investigation taking place adjacent to the players. Dame, as to varying degrees with its contemporaries, is actually less advanced in some areas than Sherlock, but the major issue is that, like many games trying to model a non-linear route through their campaigns, from the player's perspective, the end result is just a cascading series of fail states. If anger is not in the right place at the right time, or messes up and gets blocked off from a particular solution, the alternative options are typically worse. They'll be more time-consuming, more convoluted, or just less rewarding in clues or cash, which in turn makes it harder for the player to catch up as events move forward without them. Rather than contributing to the sense of the case potentially developing in new and intriguing ways, it just solidifies the idea that Dame has one ideal route, and you'll need to keep losing and restarting until you find it. But as with many of the problems we've covered so far, the seeming randomness of certain challenges, the sometimes trial and error interaction, the routine mundanities and all that, the worst shortcoming of the semi-non-linear quest design is how it exacerbates and is exacerbated by the loudest and most consistent criticism of Dame, the time limit. We've mentioned already that a lot of players disliked individual timed sequences, the pseudo-action scenes, or snooping around an office before the bad guy gets back, and how this was made slightly worse by the controls. But Beam weren't the only adventure developers guilty of that. The biggest problem is not these specific scenes, but rather the master clock, so to speak. The fact Dame features real-time progression in conjunction with a countdown to failure, which threatens to make every wasted action you take a possible game ender. In his Stay Forever interview, Mark Morrison cited two reasons for pitting players against the clock. An intentional one, which was to try and give a sense of tension and momentum to the gameplay, making players race to solve the case before it's too late, and a less intentional one, which was that, unlike other large, semi-open FMV games, Ripper for example, Beam didn't want to make players switch CDs between areas, and thus once the initial 3-day time limit is up, Dame goes to CD 2, which contains all the locations required for the latter half of the investigation. That second justification was, from Beam's perspective, unavoidable, but the first, whilst understandable, was probably a mistake for a few different reasons. First, fans of action and heart-pounding excitement tended not to buy FMV games. There's a reason they were usually put towards the end of review sections in gaming magazines, alongside puzzlers or city builders or Sims. Second, people who did like classic adventures or Myst or the like tended to appreciate their slower, more cerebral approach compared to action or reflex-oriented titles. Personally, I'm not a big adventure guy, but even I felt a bit pressured, almost anxious, whilst playing the Dame was loaded, especially after failing my first playthrough and realising how tight the 3-day deadline could be. Driving to a couple of extra areas by accident early on can pretty much end your chances of progressing past the midpoint. It seemed like the game eases off slightly in the second half, probably because the puzzles are even more convoluted, but it's odd narratively speaking since the second time limit actually makes more sense. And an additional threat is the loss of progress, with limited saves and driving back to the office taking up time, you're discouraged from saving too frequently or using up multiple save slots for the same day, which means losing bigger and bigger chunks of progression, including those in which you successfully completed some of the timed challenges. If you're going for a reasonably good ending in Dame, you are almost certainly going to run into situations in which you lose a good hour of playtime. So when you add all that to the other factors, when you combine a time limit with, first of all, individual actions like driving to different locations taking up a fair bit of time, secondly, the standard adventure game challenge of puzzles being spread across multiple locations, thirdly, the necessity of routine activities like resting, fourthly, mistakes causing you to lose time due to being knocked out or put in the slammer, and fifthly, the sadistic delight Beam took in designing a few of the sequences, well, you're going to end up with a lot of angry players. Morrison indirectly responded to this complaint in his interview by pointing out that at the time, a typical player didn't have the luxury of digital download accounts full of crap they'd bought in sales and still hadn't played. If someone bought The Dame Was Loaded back in the day, they were more likely to stick with it, and in theory, keep replaying until they got a proper ending. Morrison's not wrong to point that out. Some games were deliberately made more difficult because it was assumed players were more willing to stick with them for longer, not rent them for a weekend or drop them in favour of something they picked up for 50 cents in a Steam sale. But in my opinion, even at the time of release, that sort of trial and error adventure gameplay, puzzles being a minefield of immediate or delayed game overs, was both widely disliked and rather outdated. First, players would still drop games entirely if they were sufficiently incensed by them. I certainly had a backlog of unfinished adventures back in the 90s. Second, the trope of every wrong turn leading to being eaten by a grue, or being soft-locked because you forgot to pick up a handkerchief 4 hours earlier, was strongly associated with the more unforgiving text adventures of the 80s, or the most infamous of the Sierra titles. In the mid-90s, that sort of thing was almost unanimously seen as a negative, even within the genre. One journalist wasn't wrong to compare Dame to Beam's earliest work, such as Sherlock, though whereas they meant it as a positive, correctly pointing out Dame had more traditional adventure mechanics than many interactive movie games, it could also be taken in a negative way, since the many unforeseen pitfalls threatening Scott Anger's life and liberty seem more suited to the early 80s than 1996. In fairness, the FMV craze had at that point resulted in a bit of a resurgence in unfair and arbitrary game over screens, but this was often tempered by either reduced inconvenience, you probably weren't starting the whole game over from the beginning, or making game over scenes an attraction by ensuring they were as gory, comedic, or titillating as possible, and reviewers still didn't like them. In Dame, a game over is just a game over. It's never shocking or witty, just deflating. Ironically enough, it probably would have worked better if Dame were more like an interactive movie, clicking through movie clips rather than powering through hours of real gameplay and then getting plugged or sent down the river. It's another of the many instances in which one aspect of the game is undermining another. You understand why both elements operate the way they do, they just don't operate well with each other. I don't want to be excessively harsh on Beam for what they were attempting to do. There are definitely good ideas that were worth experimenting with, in particular emphasizing a non-linear and intuitive approach to solving cases, and making the game mechanics about detective work rather than conventional first-person adventure puzzles. It's not that there's no value in treating time itself as a resource, or modelling the mundanities of life as a deadbeat keyhole peeper, rather than the ease and excitement of a Star Pinkerton agent, or making the player work for their clues. But the way it all came together in Dame obviously wasn't to the satisfaction of many. Considered alongside Noir, Private Eye, and Under a Killing Moon, it's worth noting how Dame's rivals tried to realise the Marlowe experience with their own little twists. Noir was definitely more of a typical static screen pixel hunt type of adventure, but it's interesting to consider how it handled failure, punishing players by rewinding the progress of their investigation a little, rather than inching them towards a premature or bad ending like Dame. Not as harsh as Beam's approach, but then this would preclude the mechanic of linking a time limit to a world that develops independently of the player and clues that take account of this, which is a worthwhile idea for a detective mystery, even if it didn't work so well in Dame. Private Eye, meanwhile, included another challenge that often cropped up in hard-boiled fiction, deciding which items of evidence a PI should leave at the scene of a crime, and managing their relationship with law enforcement. Dame does touch on this with individual items and dialogue options, but it's not a standard part part of your investigations. Maybe it would have made more sense to focus on this mechanic over routines like visiting the diner, barber, or office couch. Private Eye also took a different tack with the issue of replayability by having a second mode in which some of the suspects' roles were switched around, though we'll talk about the issue of non-linear narratives and alternate story outcomes towards the end of the video. Yet both Noir and Private Eye received slightly lower scores than The Dame Was Loaded, and were both more frequently criticised for simplistic or linear gameplay. Although technically I think the two arrived slightly later than Dame, most reviewers seem to have played the three around roughly the same time, so I think the fact Dame was a lot less likely to be hit with the interactive movie complaint is testament to Beam's success, up to a point, in making it seem more like a real game. On the other hand, Under a Killing Moon was on average rated more highly than Private Eye, Noir, and Beam's game, and is certainly far better known today than any of its rivals. This could be attributed in part to Killing Moon arriving a year or two earlier, and Tex Murphy obviously being one of the better known franchises in the adventure genre, but I think reviewers had cause for judging it overall a more enjoyable detective title than the aforementioned games. Killing Moon's strength over Dame, for example, was in doing a lot of the same things, but either doing them better or in a less frustrating way. Like Dame, it gave players a certain degree of independence, letting them figure out solutions without leading them on too overtly, but without as much pressure. Players have time to think about where they want to go and what to try, and failure isn't anywhere near as likely to cause a reload or restart. It also tried to ensure that players felt like they were doing real investigative work, rather than generic puzzles, taking careful note of clues to follow up on later, interrogating NPCs, trawling police databases and such, which again Dame attempted, but Killing Moon did with more interaction, choosing what tone to take during conversations, poking around crime scenes yourself instead of waving your cursor over the screen. There are things Dame tried that Killing Moon didn't, like its living world time progression, but these either failed or tended towards divisive, whilst almost any unique mechanics Killing Moon had that weren't present in Dame were actually received well, or at least didn't turn reviewers off so badly. Still, it's tough to say that there are any lessons to be found in Dame's mixed reception. A few aspects were disliked simply because they arrived on the market at the wrong time, and one or two, like the control scheme and time limit, are issues that could perhaps have been foreseen. But a lot of the problems with Dame are not mistakes in themselves, or could have been predicted, just things that didn't work effectively together in the final product. Things that can be difficult to critique without experiencing the game as a whole. It'd be nice to see more games that try to nail the Private Eye life through unique gameplay mechanics, instead of just using the typical point-and-click formula and slathering it with noirish production values. Still, any game that sells itself as a 20th century hard-boiled detective tale is duty-bound to recreate the semi-historical sights and sounds of what Mickey Spillane called America's urban sinkholes. Mean streets patrolled by tight-booted lawmen all too eager to deliver a beating, smoky speakeasies filled with soul, swing, and sin, and cramped little offices where grim anti-heroes in pork pie hats drink themselves stupid enough to forget their regrets. In Dame's case, however, they had to film it all in Australia, quite away from the genre's favoured settings of New York, Chicago, or LA, and do it on Australian sets with an almost all-Australian cast. We've covered the question of whether Beam Software made Dame play like a 1940s noir mystery, so in the next section of the video, we'll judge whether it looks and sounds like one.
Hey, don't I know you?
You must be thinking of my brother. He's in the circus.
Oh yeah? I like the circus.
Sure you do. Which way to the rehearsal room?
Go down that way and turn left, mister.
I went backstage and got lost as quickly as possible. My cover would be blown the instant anyone heard me sing.
In Mark Morrison's interview with the Stay Forever podcast, Dame's design lead pointed out that the game wasn't the first time someone had tried to portray the mid-century America of a hard-boiled detective story directly through the eyes of the protagonist. 1947's Lady in the Lake, adapted from the Raymond Chandler story of the same name, was director Robert Montgomery's attempt to film a noir movie almost entirely from a first-person perspective, with hero Philip Marlowe seen only in reflections or short exposition-filled intermission scenes. To be clear, Morrison wasn't citing Lady in the Lake as an influence on Dame. Like most critics, from both its original release and the decades after, he dismissed it as an innovative but unsuccessful experiment in filmmaking. Even so, speaking as someone who's actually quite fond of the movie and considers it one of the better Marlowe adaptations, I think that, like Dame, it partially lives up to its claim of delivering a detective story in which we, the audience, are the protagonist, or at least the passenger riding alongside him. Scenes like Marlowe's tense return to a suspect's home, or the accusatory glare of an unwelcoming crowd, or awakening to the ministrations of a potential love interest are all enhanced by the first-person view. The Dame Was Loaded was shot in such a way that it should, theoretically, have also been able to make players feel as if they were genuinely giving and receiving all the same things inflicted by and on Scott Anger. Beam Software's cinema technology supposedly offered TV-quality visuals sharp enough to pick up detail and smooth enough to seem real. In addition, the fact that Dame was utilising almost exclusively live-action imagery made it stand out from its rivals, even those with higher budgets. FMV games might have been commonplace in the mid-90s, but even those sold on the appeal of real actors were actually more like hybrids of CGI and real life. Both the Tex Murphy series and the monstrously expensive production of Ripper involved chroma keying, a composite of live-action performers and pre-rendered backgrounds. Whereas in Dame, most of what the player sees was shot on location, so whenever a clip shows Anger interacting with props, he really is doing so. Unfortunately, as we learned earlier on, even just on a technical level, Beam weren't given that much credit for this approach. Several reviewers complained that the live-action footage was still too fuzzy and low resolution, and it was rare to see magazines of the day comparing Dame's film clips favourably over its rivals. Even more casual audiences seem to have been unimpressed. A brief review by British broadsheet newspaper The Times, for example, criticised the compromises in video quality that had been made in fitting Dame's assets onto 2 CDs. There's some merit to these complaints. On a practical level, using real sets limited Beam in ways we'll talk about later, and on a technical level, the company's claim that VideoBeam enabled TV-quality visuals was obviously a bit of an exaggeration. Dame's footage looks closer to a damaged VHS than an SD TV broadcast. Even so, when you compare the cutscenes in The Dame Was Loaded to its rivals, I think contemporary reviewers were remarkably harsh on Beam and Vixen films for what they achieved. There's a laudable consistency to scenes in Dame that's lacking in many other FMV games. In both Under a Killing Moon and Ripper, not only is there obvious artifacting where the actors and CGI backgrounds were blended together, but the performers themselves often seem physically out of place, with scale and perspective feeling off, especially in shots where one of the actors is sitting or kneeling. In Dame, you don't get that sense of wrongness. It feels like everyone is actually part of the environment because, well, most of the time they're actually there. And whilst compression techniques had definitely caught up with VideoBeam by the time of Dame's release, and quirks of converting to the lower bitrate, like oddly tinted objects, are present, it's still on average sharper and less glitchy looking than most mid-90s live-action imagery. So it's not entirely clear why Dame didn't get much praise for its visuals at the time. One possibility is that reviewers were, once again, just following the herd. The press complained about it because it was de jure to say FMV games had bad video and nobody bothered looking too closely. Another is that the downsides of blue or green screening actors and adding CGI backdrops wasn't as obvious on CRT monitors, so the benefits of Dame's approach over other games weren't as clear. Another is that though the Lawnmower Man-esque 3D graphics of Ripper and other big-budget FMV productions might seem pretty laughable to a modern player, to be seeing this sort of thing in a home computer title in the mid-90s was impressive enough that many were willing to overlook minor visual discrepancies. But the issue I noticed being raised quite frequently in contemporary reviews of Dame was not necessarily the videos themselves, but the transition between live-action footage and static gameplay screens. Whilst one or two magazines pointed out the gameplay benefits of reverting to a traditional point-and-click background instead of constructing the whole game out of video, many more reviewers complained that it was quite jarring to see everything in motion for a minute or two, but then spend half the game staring at a frozen tableau. Under a Killing Moon was partially guilty of this too. Outside of cutscenes, NPCs were sometimes in motion and sometimes stuck in the same pose for the whole game, but it's not directly comparable since it featured an actual 3D world to explore. Ripper, meanwhile, consistently used animated NPC sprites. Not necessarily a superior approach considering how comical they can look, but probably making the move between movies and gameplay less awkward. And Noir, which I think had less footage than Dame and was even more guilty of being a slideshow style adventure, at least had a few animated backgrounds to make the world seem a little more alive. In Dame, there's an extremely clear delineation between static screen gameplay and on-interactive live-action cutscenes. Beam were probably banking on the frequency of those cutscenes to soften criticism of the game being slides, but based on reviews they don't seem to have been successful. No amount of live-action footage could make up for the fact that most of the time players were just staring at a lifeless snapshot of the world, implacable corpse-like NPCs, and environments immune to the effects of lighting, wind, and weather. Again, there's no magic bullet here because all those approaches had their pros and cons, but it seems reviewers were more forgiving of pre-rendered 3D worlds and repetitive animations than they were Dame's consistent but cold visuals. We'll come back to the 3D versus photorealism question later on, but first it's worth crediting Beam and Vixen Films for why Dame's visual direction, at least, seems so fitting. A common pitfall of live-action FMV games was that even when they did use real actors and props, there was often an amateurishness to their appearance. I can't agree with anyone who says that of Dame. For a pastiche of 1940s LA, almost nothing of the game's look seems below TV quality production values. Whilst Tex Murphy's costume and makeup occasionally have the air of cosplay or pantomime, and even Ripper's stylings looking a little rushed here and there, it never seemed to me that Dame's cast were playing dress-up or filming somewhere inappropriate. I recall a comment on Usenet pointing out that if you look hard enough, you can spot little goofs like the actors handling Australian currency, and I'm fairly sure I remember noticing some snapcaps and colour-coded replica guns in a couple of cutscenes, but overall nothing really seemed amiss. Obviously, I have no idea what a 1940s newspaper office or police station should look like, but Dame's sets generally seemed akin to their depictions in American movies and TV of the era. In some cases, your first visit to a location will trigger a short tour with some extras moving about, helping make it seem a bit more lively, though aside from this you'll seldom see multiple actors interacting with each other in the same scene. Like any good hard-boiled detective drama, you'll visit a fair variety of places in Beam's fictional recreation of LA. You have Anger's run-down little back-alley PI office, contrasted with the place of work occupied by his more successful rival. You have a cheap 1940s Americana diner, a dingy motel occupied by the type of clientele who'd rather not draw attention to themselves, the home of a wealthy and seductive widow, and various other locations typical of the genre, like a glitzy nightclub, a warehouse filled with crates of hooch, a hidden retreat for a well-heeled crime boss, and so on. Were they not aware of it beforehand, I don't think the average player would pick up that none of these locations were shot in America. Vixen did a good job for the most part, concealing the fact that pretty much everything the player witnesses had actually been taking place in the city of Melbourne, in southeast Australia. Mark Morrison stated that the city was, contrary to expectations, not entirely inappropriate a shooting location for a 1940s American noir mystery. A gold rush in the second half of the 19th century had led to an explosion in Melbourne's population, jumping from a busy port colony of around 20,000 inhabitants to a metropolis of hundreds of thousands of souls, and the influx of both people and capital gave architects the opportunity to model Melbourne on the skyscraper cities of New York and Chicago. Though Melbourne went through periods of sluggish or restricted growth from the late 19th to early 20th century, by the interwar period it was experiencing an economic revival, and many of the buildings constructed or redesigned throughout the 20s and 30s were done in the Art Deco style, also favoured across the Pacific. This meant that in the 1990s, when Beam and Vixen were scouting for locations, they found that Melbourne hosted more than a few edifices that could pass for early to mid-century Los Angeles. Even so, I think Dame's environments, or its use of environments, are another area where the limitations of live action become apparent. Although the game's interiors feel very authentic, they can also seem cramped or slightly disconnected. Nightclubs and speakeasies may be a favourite of hard-boiled detective fiction, but in Dame there are sometimes obvious compromises. Players only see smaller, less populated parts of them, or view them from strange angles obviously meant to obscure something, or as in one notable case, not go inside them at all. Dame isn't anywhere near as bad as Noir when it comes to confusing perspectives. There, I was constantly getting lost because of the way in which many of the environmental shots were chained, but that's partly because Dame doesn't have as many shots per area. I assume this is partly deliberate. Unlike a lot of slideshow adventures, there aren't dozens of transition shots that have no gameplay functionality whatsoever, only relevant ones with content in them. But it's obviously partly because Beam couldn't afford to film grander or more active areas. It's very noticeable that we only see one part of a police station, that the ritzy hotel seems to be doing rather slow business, and that we don't get to see the main attraction of the nightclub. Similarly, it's impossible to hide how few exterior scenes are in the game, and how restricted they are by practical considerations. Movie clips set outside are extremely rare, poorly compensated for with various stills of a building's facade, minus traffic or people. For all the downsides of crossing live action with CGI, one major advantage is being able to depict more ambitious or fantastical scenes that would be difficult or impossible to do in real life, especially on a game development budget. Under a Killing Moon opens with a flyover of cyberpunk San Francisco and features transition movies of techs travelling further afield. Ripper, too, has some street and exterior scenes, and at larger locations, the player is travelling seamlessly and at an excruciating pace from each room or point of interest to the next. Private Eye also shows bits and pieces of the city and scenes of Marlowe driving or walking up to various areas. And Noir, being set at night and being able to obscure inconsistencies with its art direction, includes both movies and plenty of shots of the streets of 1940s LA. In this context, Dame is the title most obviously held back by technical and artistic issues, as Beam couldn't do pre-rendered 3D graphics, and sure as hell couldn't afford to recreate bustling daytime Los Angeles. Some might argue Noir's, noirish visuals are more authentic than Dame's, and we'll come back to stylization in the writing later on, but artistically, there's nothing wrong with hard-boiled detective fiction not set exclusively in rain-soaked, shadow-shrouded nighttime locales. It's just that Dame didn't have the exorbitant budget that would have been required to set it where and when they did. Putting aside a scene in an alleyway, I'm actually surprised Beam bothered doing any exterior shots in Melbourne at all. Wouldn't it have been reasonably cheap to simply use free or licensed historical photos and footage of LA, which would have included peoples and cars and such? Maybe Beam didn't think they could make the footage fit with their own, or maybe it's because they were receiving funding from the state of Victoria. Maybe part of that agreement was to promote tourism by using real locations, who knows. In any case, at least Beam weren't entirely lacking in real people to populate pseudo-Los Angeles, and those they had certainly looked the part. Pinstripe suits and pork pie hats are all the rage on the male cast, whilst the ladies sport elaborate victory rolls and pompadours and other iconic hairstyles of the day. Whether what the cast do to each other is of the day, however, is an interesting point of potential argumentation. Dame's marketing repeatedly insisted the game would feature lust, murder, and, to quote one advertisement, cleavage deeper than the Grand Canyon. But there's disappointingly little of any of the aforementioned devilry. Though Scott Anger is described as a skirt-chasing, peace-packing PI, in-game he only does a little of the former and is frequently warned off the latter, which isn't entirely true to the tone of his predecessors. Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler's stories, being rooted in the male-oriented detective fiction of pulp magazines like Black Mask, were fairly violent by the standards of the day, with some surprisingly explicit descriptions of brutal stabbings, broken necks, smashed faces, bullet-riddled corpses, and men shredded and dismembered by explosions. And Mickey Spillane, who began publishing Mike Hammer stories a little later in the post-war period, gained instant notoriety for filling his books with scenes that fans have affectionately described as psychopathic. But if The Dame Was Loaded was meant to be a period piece, it's undoubtedly closer to the cinema of the era than the original literature, the almost family-friendly Hays Code Noir of Humphrey Bogart and Dick Powell. Anger and the rest of the cast may be shot or bludgeoned, but are courteous enough not to do any unsightly bleeding in the process. And as for lust, you can forget about that. It's true that Chandler and Hammett initially wrote about sex somewhat obliquely, but in later works Chandler and Hammett both depicted their protagonists being a bit more liberal with their virtue, and from the late 40s onwards, Spillane's Hammer would typically bed at least a couple of beautiful women per case. In the context of film noir, Dame is perhaps more 1950s than 1940s in its attitude to sexuality. I doubt the Widow Creel's outfit would have passed the production code, but anyone enticed by the racy promises of its cover and marketing would have been sorely disappointed. None of the women have even the basic human decency to flash their garters once in a while. Misleading advertising aside, Beam's commitment to family values conflicts with some of their rivals.
Now, let me tell you how you fuck me, and how I'm going to fuck you.
Was it good for you, Reed? Fucking your own niece?
You little slut. Don't play victim with me.
I was 14 years old. You took my life from me, you bastard.
Who knows a woman's body better than another woman? Well, it makes perfect sense. Would you like to see me naked?
Although there were plenty of FMV games aimed at a younger audience, many titles of the mid-90s sold themselves on sex, violence, and swearing, Ripper most obviously, but other Philips Media published games, like the Voyeur series, were also promoted as mature experiences. So I was curious as to whether Beam's restraint was an artistic, commercial, or publisher-mandated decision. I asked Mark Morrison about this topic of sex and violence, and his first priority was to deny involvement with that line about the Grand Canyon. Personally, I would have taken credit for it. And also to clarify that in the game's opening, a completely random shot of actress Tiffany Lamb's backside was done entirely at the discretion of Vixen, not Beam. Having defended the company's honour, Morrison added that to the best of his recollection, Beam never had any specific discussions regarding adult content or age ratings. It simply happened to be that their vision of the game was roughly in line with noir cinema of the 40s and early 50s. But if The Dame Was Loaded is more like a hard-boiled detective film than hard-boiled detective novel, there are some ways in which it falls short of the Hollywood standard. One is the way in which it utilises its first-person perspective, again injured by technical limitations. I mentioned how Lady in the Lake was in certain scenes very successful at using this conceit to immerse viewers in the moment, whether one of danger, excitement, or intimacy. There are times Dame comes close to this, when a gun is pointed directly at the player, or a femme fatale tries to apply her womanly wiles, but the division between static and moving imagery undermines this. No matter how strong the actor's performance, if there's a choice involved, the game has to pause, and the spell is broken as the character stares dumbly at the screen. Speaking of awkward stares, one of the strangest choices made in regard to dialogue scenes is seemingly random close-ups of a character's face, framed so tightly you can see the crow's feet around their eyes. At first I assumed assumed this was a deliberate shock tactic to warn the player that they were agitating someone, but there are various conversations in which the game cuts to these shots for no reason, which just makes you confused and a bit uncomfortable. I don't know whether this was an oversight. Maybe there was more than one person scripting these scenes, and at least one of them thought the close-ups were just for variety, or whether you were perhaps originally supposed to be judging the character's emotional state from these shots to tell if they were lying or something, kind of like what LA Noir would do around 15 years later. Or perhaps, as Morrison seemed to indicate, there's some kind of technical reason for framing shots in this way. An additional issue with the cinematic side of Dame, not a mistake exactly, but a missed opportunity, is that the timed sequences don't really give any visual cues as to how much time is left, which is both a bit unfair, obviously, but also undermines the tension. There are some good scenes in Lady in the Lake and other more conventional Marlowe adaptations, where we're peeping through a crack in a door to see what someone is doing, or when they're coming back. It's a shame Dame didn't frame the scenery and performers in some of the timed sequences, so that we could have a couple of extra stills of the suspect getting closer to the room we were in, for example. Again, one of those things that probably could have been changed at the last minute, were it not for the fact Beam could only make use of the photography and film produced earlier on in production. It wasn't like they could render out a new scene, only try their best to stretch what they had or make use of some cut footage. And Morrison mentioned that one of the endings was added much later by recording some new lines and extending a clip of Anger driving outside the city that had been utilised in part for an earlier scene. Of course, the centrepiece of Dame's cinematic aspirations were its stars, another aspect of the shoot that could only be as good as its budget allowed.
Mr. Spencer?
No, I'm Scott Anger. That's Ralph Spencer over there.
Ma'am?
How can we help you, Mrs.
Klein. Miss Carol Klein.
As with the environments, Dame's cast are merely stand-ins for its American setting, almost to a man entirely Australian performers. Unlike the well-funded Ripper, which featured instantly recognisable B and C listers from Tinseltown, Dame's stars were at the time hardly household names even in their own country. The best known actors Beam were able to afford were Gus Mercurio, who plays Officer Denton, a veteran of Australian television with several bit parts and supporting roles in movies to his name, and Matthew King, who does Anger's voice and is glimpsed in-game as another character, gangster Thumbs Mackenzie. Also relatively experienced performers were Randall Berger, who plays Anger's partner, and Sally Ann Upton, the scowling proprietor of Meg's Diner, the latter of whom had done a lot of domestic daytime TV and dramas. The other leads were, in the mid-90s, mostly young and unknown soap opera and stage actors, such as Tiffany Lamb, whose character serves as the inciting incident for the narrative, Shannon Asmar, playing the femme fatale around whom the game's marketing somewhat erroneously revolved, and Terry Wadle as Anger's former and potentially future love interest. Some of these younger actors would go on to greater success in either Australian daytime TV or the movies. Despite the disparity in the cast's acting experience, I think Beam or Vixen Films spent enough money and gave enough direction to elevate the performances in Dame above most FMV games, even if the bar for that standard is really just don't be laughably bad. Whilst unsurprisingly Ripper's performances were a lot more memorable than Dame's, at least Dame was actually using professional actors in the first place. Some rival FMV developers hired Playboy models and softcore porn stars, or just played half the roles themselves. So I don't agree with magazines that criticised Dame's cast. At the very least, they ensured the game lacks that air of amateurishness that was endemic to the genre. Still, the sticking point for a few reviewers, it seems, was the accents, which, even as a non-American, I did pick up on sometimes.
Seems that a daylight raid liberated a cache of diamonds from the First National Bank on June 15th.
Oh, Scott, look at this.
You'd better sack your cleaning lady.
Native American speakers who play Dame will obviously be more likely to notice and be bothered by this, although looking at American reviews, it didn't seem that common for them to bring this up as a criticism. If the actors were doing that bad a job, you'd think every American magazine would mention it.
Oh, Scott, your face. What happened to you?
Never mind that. What happened to your apartment?
Someone's been through it.
Obviously.
I suppose it might be they were just being polite, or since the game was characterized as a spoof by some reviewers, they assumed the cast were deliberately putting on bad accents.
Au revoir, Scott. That's French for see you later.
It could also be that some of them weren't sure whether the pronunciation was wrong or not. Dame is not only set in the 1940s, it's aping a genre that, on screen and TV, has played host to everything from the outdated mid-Atlantic accents of some noir stars to the exaggerated regional dialects often applied to mobsters, moles, and police. Maybe reviewers assumed anyone speaking oddly in Dame was just emulating a specific period or character type.
I like you, Anger. I'll let you go. But if I catch you with a gun again, I'm gonna revoke your private investigator's license, and you're out of wake, you understand?
You're all hot.
Now, personally, I'm no expert, but it did seem to me some of the speakers were more noticeably off than others. As a British speaker, I didn't really notice anything wrong with the accents on the older stars, Berger or Mercurio, because I think those two, though Australian, either grew up or spent a few years working in the US, though maybe an American would pick up on their errors. And Mark Morrison mentioned that by luck, at least one of the actors was a real American. If I remember correctly, he was referring to Michael Edward Stevens, who plays Mac, though I might be wrong and there were other USonians. Either way, 2 or 3 of the characters sounded reasonably North Atlantic to my ears. The rest of the cast, though, don't seem entirely consistent.
This guy ever been here?
Never seen him.
Some of them are able to conceal their oceanic origins most of the time, but occasionally say things oddly, especially when angry or emotional, and others don't seem to be trying at all, to the point I think they're supposed to be playing characters from completely different countries. One character is Chinese, and I think another meant to be Irish, so maybe I missed some dialogue about other ethnicities.
1/4. Thank you.
The detective genre is known for more than its characters' speech patterns, however. Any media that follows a sour-faced Snoop nosing through the sleazy streets of Los Angeles is burdened with the expectation of distant gunfire, wailing sirens, and, most important of all, the sound of so-called jazz noir, or some variant thereof, often both diegetic, emanating from clubs and bars, or as an underscore, usually to communicate a sense of sorrow or social isolation. The life of a Chandler-esque PI is not an especially cheerful one. Earl Hagen's Harlem Nocturne, originally composed in 1939 and reused, typically with a darker twist, in various forms across almost a century's worth of the noir mediascape, is about as jaunty as the genre gets. But the general ambience in The Dame Was Loaded is far softer and more naturalistic than you'd expect. One PR release boasted that Dame's composers, Marshall Parker and David Briggs, had produced a unique jazz score just for Dame, but Beam don't seem to have made a whole lot of use of it.
The average fellow won't cite it. The side she keeps most private. It's only seen through private eyes.
There's an overture at the start, a variant with lyrics used for the credits, which is slightly different to the one that plays in the 1995 demo, and a game over track. What few other songs were composed for the Dame are seldom heard.
I'm glad you feel at home, Mr. Anger.
Most interactive scenes are silent, aside from sound effects and generally unintrusive environmental noise. There are a few times I thought I'd disabled my speakers. Maybe Beam didn't want to detract from the 6 hours of spoken dialogue they'd recorded, or didn't think a looping background score would fit with the constant cuts to live-action video, but personally I wasn't too pleased with this strategy. In terms of straightforward audio quality, there's sometimes an echo or crackling from one spoken line to the next. This can be noticeable in conversations like the opening scene.
The police have not been helpful.
They're not as a rule, Miss Klein, but we are.
and sometimes even occurs between individual lines from the same character. For example, the protagonist will be internally monologuing, and you can hear an echo on some parts of it, but not others. Presumably some of these lines were recorded at a different time. Furthermore, the default volume settings sometimes make speech incomprehensible under the background noise. I remember some magazines griping about this.
That's a low blow, Denham.
Oh yeah.
But those are sideshows to the central issue. Minus music and speech, Dame's audio design isn't all that enthralling. The ambience is at best workmanlike and doesn't contribute to the atmosphere in the slightest. There's the sound of machinery in the foundry, but it doesn't make the murder scene any more menacing. There's background chatter in the police station, but it doesn't tell you anything about the soul of the city or its inhabitants. Only 2 or 3 locations are scored, the alley bar and the first visit to the Widow Creel, for example, and they benefit from it. There's also a track for the Palm Tree Motel, though this is only meant to add to the silliness of the scene. Another place you can hear music is your car. There's a couple of different tracks for, I think, each act of the game, or maybe it depends on day and night time, which would be a great idea if you actually spent any time cruising around LA. In reality, you'll probably only hear it for 10 to 20 seconds at a time when using the map or going through the trunk. Now, I generally don't even like that kind of music, but Dame suffers from the fact that it has neither a strong background score nor a particularly immersive ambience. Compare, first of all, a gameplay scene from Dame to one from Ripper, which is consistently playing music. Alternatively, consider a similar sequence, but this time alongside Noir, a shadowy thriller, which relies more on environmental noise to set the mood. I think in both cases, Dame comes out sounding much worse. Even in lengthy cutscenes, it's unusual to hear a saxophone or anything of the like. A strange omission for a noir story. If Beam wanted to do something a little different to the usual cliches, that's fair enough, but if the limited use of Dame's soundtrack is intentional, I think it was the wrong move. Like I said, I think the actors' performances were fine, but they would have been enhanced by more incidental music, like when you first meet Louise Creel.
Handsome strangers are all too rare these days.
And if they didn't go that route, then they should have at least put more work into the acoustics in the tenser gameplay scenes. I'm sure the composers were capable of it. Marshall Parker, for example, eventually went on to become an audio director at Ubisoft. But as it stands, for most of Dame, I didn't feel like I was there, and I certainly didn't feel emotionally invested in what was happening. I'm no sound man, but if the audio in a game doesn't contribute to either of those, then it probably failed to do its job. Part of my job, however, is to let you know what to do if you want to play the game today, and fortunately for both of us, that won't take very long at all. As already noted, Dame was never formally released on any system other than PC. A Mac version was finished, but according to Mark Morrison and various other sources, not widely circulated. I did see some copies on eBay that were purportedly for the Macintosh, apparently published by Anphogram, making me wonder if, at some point after the original release, the Mac port report did get a retail launch, and perhaps Morrison was just unaware of it. I did put this to him, and he suggested it was certainly a possibility. Recall that Anthrogram actually bought Beam Software sometime after Dame's release. I suppose it doesn't really matter at this point, however. Anyone looking to play Dame is probably going to get it from GOG or Steam, both of which, as of writing, run the PC version through DOSBox. I wasn't able to find any references to notable bugs or alternate releases. Some European countries received localized versions with full speech, which, according to what I've read, are not included in the Steam release, though I can't confirm that. I always assume most people go for GOG. Also, there is an old patch floating around, though from what I can tell it was only to make Dame fully compatible with Windows 95, and I assume isn't part of the emulated digital releases. The only issue that seems to trip people up with the re-releases is forgetting to use Ctrl F4 to swap disks at the halfway point. I haven't seen any complaints about it not working on Windows 11 or anything like that. It seems like the unfinished CDI version is a bit of a holy grail for some CDI collectors, but I don't think anyone's ever actually gotten their hands on it. If and how it differed from the CD release, such as in video quality, is unknown, but maybe it'll leak onto the grey market one day. So I guess if you're still interested in playing Dame, go to GOG, double check the reviews or forums to ensure there are no new issues, and buy it. You can find it on sale pretty frequently. As for the rest of you, who've already played or don't care to play through Dame, that leaves us free to focus on the final section of the video. There are few genres with tropes, themes, and prose as immediately recognisable as the hard-boiled detective story, and Beam were clearly banking on that to help sell a title described by some as a tribute to noir, and by others as a parody of it. Mark Morrison has stated that he pitched the title to Beam owing to his own fondness for the classic Chandler-esque narrative. Ergo, we'll use our remaining time to examine whether the world and writing of The Dame Was Loaded was closer to that of Hammett, Chandler, or Spillane, or indeed if it was particularly close to any of them, as well as how reviewers in the 90s responded to it. But first of all, we're going back to the 1940s, so take a swig of whiskey, pull your pants up high, and strap on those suspenders. You can spare the fedora, because we'll be stepping into the role of Scott Anger and experiencing a classic tale of diamonds, dames, and death.
A photo of Angela Donald. She's dead now. My fault. I don't want to think about it because if I do, I'll need a drink and then another, and before long I'll be waking face down in the gutter again.
In the topsy-turvy life of Private Eye Scott Anger, trouble always starts with a woman. This time, it was Angela Donald, a torch singer at the Sweet Dreams nightclub, a classy lady who owed her career to the patronage and perversions of Los Angeles' classless criminal elite. A cute little songbird like her was good business for the otherwise unprofitable nightclub, and a nice trophy for the big men who ran LA's underworld. But when the Sweet Dreams conveniently burned down, Angela, having glimpsed a rough-looking stranger leaving the same night, and finding herself the police's prime witness in an arson investigation, became a very expensive inconvenience to her former employers. Scott Anger was hired to protect her, and it wasn't long before a man who should have known better ended up falling head over heels in love with his own client. But one night in June, as the two headed back up to the offices of the Spencer and Anger Detective Agency, a green sedan with two rough-looking men pulled up across from the alley. Within seconds, guns had been drawn. Bullets flew, but only one found its mark, right in Angela Donald's throat. Anger took the murder of his lover badly, not least because he was the only one who seemed to want to talk about it. There were no other direct witnesses to the crime, and even his partner, Ralph Spencer, warned him to stay off the case. All his contacts on the force could confirm were the caliber of the bullets, the colour of the sedan, and that bystanders on the next block claimed to have seen a woman in an expensive fur coat fleeing down the street around the same time. Scott Anger made the death of Angela Donald his personal crusade, but the only Jerusalem he found was the bottom of a whiskey glass. After a month of nothing but dead ends and hard drinking, Anger became reckless and self-destructive, blaming everyone for his failure: himself, the bottle, the authorities, and especially the competition, hotshot New York PI Carl Brewer, who had been only too eager to pour the drinks for his rival. In the end, Anger found himself back at the local police department, and in the drunk tank. Deemed unfit to carry a dangerous weapon, Anger was stripped of the right to carry a heater and barely hung on to his private investigator license. But it was also the cold bucket of water he needed to convince him to try and put his life back together. By late July, Scott Anger had returned to work, hoping for a lucky break that would put some cash in his pocket and maybe a little hint of pride back in his step. And heaven delivered another angel to Scott Anger, even if the angel in question didn't know it herself. Stepping into the office on the morning of July 29th was a mousy little blonde by the name of Carol Klein, a small-town girl in the big city, in need of the kind of help only a private eye could offer. Carol's brother Dan had moved to LA to find work, and had been sending regular checks back to the family in Yellow Plains, Oregon. But according to Carol, the family have not received word from her brother in almost 2 months. Dan's last letter, sent in May, referenced having met a girl, but neither Carol nor the Los Angeles Police Department know anything else about him, other than that his last address, a cheap boarding house, was knocked down the same month as Dan's final letter. Carol is outraged by Ralph Spencer's suggestion that her brother had eloped with his new girlfriend, insisting that something must have happened to Dan, and begs the firm's services in finding him. Carol Klein is offering Anger the 2 things in this world he needs most right now: the chance to be another woman's knight in shining armor, and the chance to pay his rent. The pretty Miss Klein pays up and departs for Oregon, carrying a promise from Anger that her brother will be returned safe and sound. As soon as she leaves, however, Ralph warns Anger that the Klein's money is only good for 3 days. During Scott's month-long absence, Spencer was fortunate enough to snatch a case from under the noses of both Carl Brewer and the Pinkertons, a very well-paid job in New York tailing a crooked lawyer, and on August 1st, Anger needs to be on the train to the firm's next paycheck. Finally back on the streets of LA, Anger turns to his usual sources for clues as to Dan's whereabouts, but very few are happy to see Anger return. Reporter Frankie Henderson, at least, is one of Scott Anger's more forgiving friends, probably more forgiving than she should be. Frankie and Scott used to be an item, until Angela Donald walked into Scott's life, and Frankie Henderson walked in on the both of them. Frankie is willing to put Anger's indiscretions, personal and professional, behind her, and luckily for him, she's not the only benevolent soul in Los Angeles. Officer Jim Denton, formerly of the Homicide Squad, is another of Scott's friends who hasn't exactly benefited from their relationship. Sticking up for the PI one too many times has knocked Denton off Homicide and onto a permanent assignment to the station's front desk. Fortunately for Anger, the one-time detective still likes and, up to a point, respects him, or at least what he used to be. If he didn't, Scott would probably still be in jail, but Denton has no intention of sticking his neck out so far again. Still, a private eye can only get so far in LA with friends on the right side of the law. Down in Dog Alley is Jake's Joint, a seedy bar whose owner is a lot more familiar with Anger than he ever wanted to be. Their last meeting involved gunshots and a sea of broken glass. Once Anger makes amends with Jake, he reacquaints himself with his old poker buddies, 3 men whose knowledge and participation in LA's filthy underbelly have made them useful sources of information to any PI willing to skirt the limits of legal propriety. Move-in Mickey Murphy, the most honest fence in the city, Ashley G.G. McPherson, a gambler with the darnest luck on the ponies, and Red Randall Hanna, a straight-shooting goon for hire, may not like PIs, but they do like taking their money, and when they're happy, they're willing to talk more than a sensible heel should. From his sources, Anger begins to piece together some details about Dan Klein. Details his small-town, good-natured, God-fearing sister either didn't want to know or didn't want to tell. Contrary to what they told sweet little Carol, Dan Klein is in fact known to the police, but under the name of Dan Small, a hood rat with no record as of yet. According to Jim Denton, Dan Klein hardly rated a mention, but word on the street was that Klein was seen with a ne'er-do-well of a little more note, Frederick Freddie Creel. Creel's own crimes may not have merited much attention from the police, but the discovery of his body at the bottom of an industrial crusher did, a fate supposedly delivered at the hands of another known offender, Thumbs Mackenzie. Anger begins investigating Creel's death and uncovers a number of surprising facts. First, it seems that Spencer and Anger is not the only firm looking into Freddie Creel and his associates. Carl Brewer has also been seen flashing his license around town in search of information on Creel, Klein, and Mackenzie. Second, according to Thumbs, the three had only recently pulled a job together, a job that Mackenzie says both his compatriots cheated him on, and with Creel dead and Mackenzie fingered for the deed, Thumbs' own suspicions fall on Dan Klein. Third, Freddie Creel's widow is tied to all three, and to Angela Donald. The recently bereaved Mrs. Creel is Angela's half-sister. Anger inevitably finds himself eye to eye with the young woman, who turns out to be as beautiful and alluring as her dearly departed sibling. Louise Creel says she's no gangster's mole, that she's an honest lady and a good wife who knows nothing about Freddie's supposed ties to the Los Angeles underworld. Anger thinks this sister is good, alright, good at playing any number of roles, from one minute to the next, the grieving partner, the vengeful spouse, the lonely and vulnerable widow, the red-hot seductress, or the pretty little bird who had her wings clipped by the rough men who've used and abused her. Anger doesn't know which of these is the real Louise, maybe all of them are, but he does know there's something in the Creel residence worth finding. As it turns out, there's at least two somethings. A photograph of Mrs. Creel outside LA's First National Bank, and a life insurance policy on Frederick with a lucrative payout. Louise reveals that the bank photo is one of many. Her husband had taken a number of pictures of her at that particular location, and concedes her darling Freddie may in fact have been mixed up in some underhanded business. It's a frightening thought for a virtuous young thing like Louise Creel, and she hopes Scott will be there for her if trouble ever knocks at her door. He already suspects it will. Anger follows up on the First National Bank and begins to get a sense of how Creel, Klein, and Mackenzie are involved, and why one of them has already turned up dead. It seems the First National was recently the unlucky victim of a double heist, and strangely enough, that the first job foiled the second. 3 unidentified bandits were able to liberate a cache of diamonds from the bank in a daring daylight raid, each fleeing in a different direction. But almost the same moment the police arrived, 6 armed men chose that particularly inopportune moment to try and pull a second robbery, all of whom were immediately arrested and incarcerated, by coincidence in the same prison as Thumbs Mackenzie. Despite the city's best efforts, the original 3 thieves remain unidentified, and the ICE still at large. If Anger wants to find Dan Klein, he may need to find those diamonds first. But Anger and the police aren't the only ones interested in the aftermath of the heist, and it may not be the first time Anger has crossed the path of these competing parties. As soon as Scott Anger gets close to his goal, those involved in the case begin getting hurt, or worse. Anger's movements are being stalked by someone driving a green sedan, and Anger himself is soon accosted by the 2 Charlies, a sociopathic weasel and a witless brute with a mean hook, both with lengthy rap sheets, both more than willing to kill to get their hands on the missing diamonds. And right on cue, Louise Creel contacts Anger, begging for his protection from Big Joel Jones, a wealthy businessman with a nasty reputation and a long reach. A reach, whispers Jim Denton, that extends all the way into the mayor's office and the Los Angeles Police Department. It was Big Joel who made Angela Donald what she was, who took her under his wing and into his bed, then tossed her away when he was finished with her. Jones has been in the news recently. His new joint, the Blue Angel, is opening soon, right atop the cooling ashes of the Sweet Dreams nightclub. It's as if past and present are aligning, the black hole of Anger's bleak June coming to swallow him up again, bringing back the pain of Angela Donald's brutal murder. Louise Creel tells Anger that she and her sibling couldn't stand each other, but that when Angela died, it felt like half of her was ripped away along with her sister. Now it seems as if Big Joel's thugs are coming for the other half of her, and only Scott can stop them. But back then, he had a clear head and a piece strapped to his side, and he still failed his lady love. This time all he has is a concussion and a firearm charge hanging over him. When looking down the barrel of a .45, can a private eye get by with his wits alone? He'll need to figure it out fast, because old sins don't rest easy in the City of Angels. There'll be a blood price to pay for both the fire and the ice, and before the summer is up, it'll be spilled by the guilty and innocent alike. The ghosts of the past are hungry for retribution, and if Scott Anger wants to give the dead their due, he'll need to repay every man or woman that deserves it. The only question is, will justice come from the gavel or the hammer? And if Scott is still standing at the end of it, will there be anyone left alive willing to stand beside him? Dame's international release in 1996 was, for both English language and foreign reviewers, a welcome opportunity to exercise their creative writing talents, penning a brief passage or paragraph in the Chandler-esque or Spillanian style to open the review, for example. And who can blame them? Despite its American origins, or if we're being nitpicky, Irish Anglo-American origins in the case of Chandler, the hard-boiled detective genre, or mood to some critics, is as equally familiar to a US audience as it is a British, Australian, German, French, or Japanese one. What Mark Morrison called The Dame Was Loaded was localised as Une poupée pleine usée in France, as Puppen, Perlen und Pistolen in Germany, and La Signora Calibro 32 in Italy. The Stay Forever podcast complained that the German title was a misnomer, that pearls don't even play a part in Dame's narrative, which is mostly true, but also irrelevant. The purpose of these names was clearly to evoke the classic tropes of P.I. Noir and its cousins. The game might as well have been called Trenchcoat Dolls, or LA Heat, or Dick with a 45, or something equally silly. Aren't those band names? And it would have communicated the same thing. If you have the slightest interest in film noir or mid-century detective fiction, you'll be able to recognise rather unsubtle references in both the major and the minor story beats of The Dame Was Loaded. The washed-up PI recovering from the loss of a lover, the wide-eyed out-of-town girl looking for her brother, the nightclub singer, the ex-flame, the gangster's mole, the bad guy's country escape, the old buddy on the force too honest for his own good, and so on. That doesn't necessarily mean the narrative is wholly derivative. There's a pretty substantial amount of possible variations a writer could make with the same tropes arranged in a different way. So even though Dame had so many familiar features from the genre, I actually misidentified where the plot was going on a couple of occasions because I assumed it would just copy Chandler. I was convinced there was going to be a Lady in the Lake switcheroo with two characters, and a little sister revelation in the final meeting with Carol Klein, neither of which really occurred. Still, I imagine it wouldn't be too hard for a noir enthusiast to make a list of virtually everyone and everything in Dame and match them to a specific book or movie. Something I particularly liked was how Beam tried to insert some hard-boiled urbanite lingo into the script. A private eye is a Seamus, a dollar is a smacker, and all that, but I was disappointed they didn't do this as much as Chandler or Spillane. I don't recall any references to tomatoes, flatties, chippies, or chiselers, for example. I guess they wanted to ensure the dialogue was immediately comprehensible. You can't do a double take on new words like you can when you're reading. And whilst we'll go into a bit more detail on Dame's tone later on a surface level the game is thematically very much hard-boiled noir. Scott Anger might be seasoned, streetwise and smart, but that doesn't prevent him being repeatedly ambushed or betrayed, and no matter which ending you get, you certainly won't be walking away with fame, riches and respect. Most of the characters have a wariness and cynicism to them, typical of detective fiction. Several are liars, and a couple of Anger's own friends are concealing some rather nasty secrets from him. Oh, and of course, Anger himself is a drunk. The narrative is mostly centered around the lower rungs of Los Angeles society, working men, criminals, or outsiders. Anger won't be mingling with politicians or Hollywood producers, and he won't be visiting anywhere more exotic than the lobby of an expensive hotel. There are, of course, a few criminal conspiracies afoot, but of a fairly mundane nature. Don't expect to expose election fraud or espionage. Still, although the story never goes to the higher tier of Los Angeles' social strata, it doesn't wallow in the mud either. Dame might involve fences and hitmen, but it's never as grim as an early Mike Hammer. You're not interrogating prostitutes or drug addicts. So it's no surprise more creatively minded writers reviewing the game had little trouble matching its style in magazines of the day. But whilst Dame's fidelity to the genre might have made it easy for journalists to pen their reviews, it did not necessarily endear them to it. Many reviewers felt that the game's writing was too predictable for its own good, too reliant on the same premise, plot twists, and character archetypes players would undoubtedly have encountered 100 times before. As PC Entertainment put it, there's a fine line between being vintage and being cliched. The Dame Was Loaded falls on the wrong side of it, explaining, sure, it's got goons, dames, and crimes of passion, but it ain't Philip Marlowe. Similarly, Charles Ardai complained that, I don't think there is one thing in The Dame Was Loaded that you haven't seen before in a dozen Private Eye movies. And naturally enough, the words stock and cliché turned up quite frequently in reviews from other publications. Was that really the problem with the game's writing, though? As easy as it is to compile a list of overused storytelling techniques in private eye-oriented media, that same criticism dates back nearly 100 years, all the way to the founding of the genre. When Raymond Chandler began submitting stories to Black Mask magazine in the 1930s, he was following in the footsteps of Dashiell Hammett's Poisonville and The Maltese Falcon from the 1920s, and Hammett himself was continuing in a tradition established by Carol John Daly's Race Williams stories. Characters in Chandler's earliest novels make metatextual jokes about investigating corrupt nightclub owners or being held at gunpoint by double-dealing femme fatales. Yet none of that seems to have limited the popularity of these stories among the general public, if not literary critics, nor that of their cinematic adaptations, which reached the height of their success in the 1940s. And Mickey Spillane did not formally publish his first Mike Hammer novel, I, the Jury, until 1947. By all rights, the hard-boiled detective story should have been on the out by this point, yet much to the everlasting and impotent fury of educated commentators like Ernest Hemingway, Spillane would go on to become one of the most successful novelists of the 20th century. Admittedly, noir and detective fiction of this sort seemed to be drying up in the 60s and 70s. Pulp author Lee Brackett, who had co-written the screenplay for the famous 1946 cinematic adaptation of The Big Sleep, was in the 1970s brought on to help adapt another Chandler novel, The Long Goodbye, starring Elliot Gould and directed by Robert Altman. She would later recall that by that point in time, the private detective seemed so overplayed as to be a joke, and that many involved felt the story needed to be modernized and demythologized to keep it fresh. The movie was thus set contemporaneously, featuring an insouciant anti-authority Marlowe living next to an apartment of hippies baking marijuana cakes and doing naked yoga on the balconies. But the evidence seems to point to this idea of hard-boiled fiction being too dated as a mistake. In Tom Williams' 2014 biography of Chandler, the 1973 movie is characterized as having, quote, appealed to 1970s audiences increasingly anxious about urban alienation and corruption at the highest levels. But this is slightly misleading. The film was widely regarded as being a failure when it first opened, repelling audiences who were expecting a classic hard-boiled detective story. It was only after being remarketed and retrospectively revised by movie critics as an arty, countercultural cinematic icon of the era that it achieved any measure of fame, well regarded as a Robert Altman film, but not necessarily as a PI tale. And keep in mind, a year after The Long Goodbye came one of the most famous examples of neo-noir movie making, Polanski's Chinatown. 2 years later, Robert Mitchum starred in a far more traditionalist take on Chandler, Farewell My Lovely, which, conversely to Goodbye, did better on release than it has with later critics. And in the 80s and 90s, the mediascape leading up to Dame's release proved that, contra Brackett and others, creatives, financiers, and audiences were still open to stories about hard-drinking PIs in a trench coat and fedora. Writers like James Ellroy were still writing noir fiction set in the 40s and 50s, and screenwriters had not abandoned the era or the mood either. Philip Marlowe returned to television in 1983 in Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe Private Eye, starring Powers Booth, which ran until 1986, whilst Stacy Keach would take the role of Mike Hammer in several TV movies and serials from 1983 until 1989, then again post-Dame Was Loaded for a single 26-episode season from 1997 to 1998. Alongside various PI TV shows were noirish or hard-boiled detective movies set in past or present, to say nothing of films matching the vaguer labels of neo-noir thriller or neo-noir period crime. And in the early 90s, it was impossible to turn on the TV and not see a cartoon character doing their best impression of Sam Spade. Critics had been intermittently complaining about the PI genre being oversaturated for decades prior to Mark Morrison picking up a pen, yet the same stories, the same characters, kept coming back year after year. So it would seem incorrect to assume that The Dame Was Loaded disappointed reviewers because it suffered from the same ailment as incalculable numbers of works produced from the 30s or 40s onwards. No matter how many times the touchstones of the genre are dismissed as overused and outdated, they always seem to eventually attract an audience again. There's obviously a reason people like coming back to wisecracking PIs with a penchant for fast woman and popping a goon's face inside out. In his Stay Forever interview, Morrison, twice without prompting, self-reflexively criticised his own script as a self-insert fantasy for white American men, but I think he's being a bit too liberal with the old progressive cat-o'-nine-tails. Anger's story is meant to be experienced vicariously, not as a direct self-insert avatar, and healthy males of any ethnicity can appreciate the appeal of being fawned over by nightclub singers and shooting gangsters. Still, the protagonist of The Dame Was Loaded, like Chandler or Hammett's heroes, does not live a life of riches or martial prowess. There are no shootouts, no expensive cars, nor a parade of luscious, loose women. Lee Brackett argued that Philip Marlowe was essentially a loser, and wrote him as such in the 1973 movie. The same seems to be true of Scott Anger. Like Marlowe, Anger is no Superman. He's not a gunfighter or commando. He's not remarkably charming. He's a sap who often takes the fall for others, and to both police and powerful mobsters, he's no more than a nuisance. It begs the question of why audiences like pretending to be a bankrupt alcoholic whose typical day is spent being yelled at by police or smacked around and thrown in garbage cans. Chandler answered this himself in and out of his stories, with frequent allusions to the chivalric heroes he had read about as part of his education, and himself had tried to write prior to inventing Marlowe. The novels include references to slaying dragons and rescuing comely maidens who don't seem to be trying very hard to escape from their predicaments, and of the private eye as a knight in shining armour living in a world that no longer wanted them. Even as a bum, scorned by society, beaten by footpads and betrayed by woman, Scott Anger, like his predecessors, is still a male fantasy, bruised but unbowed, honourable in an honourless world, and so on. Chandler was bullied into marrying off Marlowe towards the end of his career, but in letters to friends and colleagues concluded that personal and professional success wasn't for his hero. In his words, quote, "I think he will always have a fairly shabby office, a lonely house, a number of affairs, but no permanent connection. I see him always in a lonely street, in lonely rooms, puzzled but never quite defeated." unquote. This seems to be Beam's view of Scott Anger, perennially struggling, alone, unrespected, and occasionally unlawful, but still the hero, a shop-soiled Galahad as Chandler put it. Poor because he needs something to work towards, weak because he's the underdog, single because there'll always be another woman. Whether this was as conventional a fantasy as would have appealed to audiences in the mid-90s is another matter though. Chandler and Hammett's books might have achieved more critical success, but it was the sex-fueled, blood-crazed vigilante adventures of Spillane's Mike Hammer that truly resonated with readers. A hero who certainly takes a few lumps, but nevertheless constitutes a more conventional power fantasy for men, blasting through scores of bad guys, swooned over by women from all walks of life, and worshipped by his own sexy secretary. No wonder readers, or customers as Spillane called them, were happy to keep buying Hammer novels, which would eventually morph into what some critics characterized as proto-James Bond stories. Dame's cover teased hot guns, hot dames, and hot ice, but in-game was a rather more placid affair. Scott Anger might have the name of a Spillanian hero, but is hardly a masculine icon. Would anyone who bought and played Dame have wanted to experience a second case, in which they couldn't even carry a gun in the first act of the game, and were punished for using it in the second, could barely fight off a single opponent half their size, hardly got anywhere with women who didn't have an ulterior motive, and in most endings end up dead, alone, or hitched, but also morally and legally compromised? I assume this is why later in development, Beam created an extra, somewhat more upbeat conclusion, the Blade Runner end, as Morrison called it, presumably in reference to the infamous studio-mandated theatrical ending of the Neo-Noir 1982 film. How many players bothered trying to get it is an open question. Part of the difficulty of writing a satisfying story for a game is, as always, having little control over when the player triggers certain scenes, in what order, what they were doing in the meantime, and all the rest. And Dame, on top of this, faced the challenge of featuring multiple routes and outcomes. Alternate endings were very much a marketing point of many FMV games, but reviewers, initially intrigued, quickly turned on the practice due to either the compromises required, Voyeur, for example, dropping save games and forcing players to reach the ending in a single session, or the fact that even the biggest budget titles overpromised and underdelivered, as was the case with Ripper, which promoted itself on randomizing the identity of the killer, but in which playthroughs were identical until the final act, and the supposed 4 different endings turned out to be the same cutscene 4 times with a couple of lines changed. Dame's issues aren't quite as straightforward. There are numerous unique bad ends throughout the investigation, and the final act isn't clearly delineated into separate routes. If a player makes it past a certain point in the last part of the investigation, they may not even be entirely sure whether the ending they received was meant to be a definitive one, or be aware they had missed a piece of evidence that might have influenced it. As I mentioned in the gameplay section, Mark Morrison seemed confident that players would be willing to commit to several replays in order to achieve the ending they desired, but I'm a little skeptical as to how much repetition they'd put up with, or whether they cared enough to try, especially considering the limited save slots. I mean, for example, it's certainly possible to make a downer ending compelling if the rest of the story leads into it and reflects its themes well enough, but since there can be a certain degree of variation to the events preceding Dame's endings, I don't think Beam were able to create a particularly strong or satisfying sense of closure or consistency to any of them. Philip Marlowe, Private Eye, took a different approach, writing one narrative that mostly followed the original novel, and another for an alternate playthrough that players could choose at the start, whilst Noir gave the impression of being non-linear and open-ended, but actually featured a lot of gating, and in a narrative sense, only featured some minor variation between each case, with one proper finale. Considering Beam's budget, I imagine Morrison and co. probably would have been able to craft a more coherent script with either of those strategies. 2 distinct storylines for 2 successful playthroughs, let's say a Chinatown-esque tone tone for one, and a Bogart and Bacall big sleep for the other, or the main plot only featuring one or two endings, and the variation being in the side investigations. Beam's muddled, semi-non-linear narrative might have worked had it felt to the player that they were consciously making meaningful choices to influence the fates of Anger and the rest of the cast, but I think Dame's endings feel more like things you trip over whilst bumbling through each replay, rather than the intentional outcome of the player's decisions. All that said, this aspect of Dame's disappointing critical reception only covers word of mouth from people who finished it. What it doesn't account for is why there wasn't a whole lot of interest in the first place. I said earlier I was skeptical of critics' claims in 1996 that the detective genre was overplayed. This argument had been disproved multiple times throughout the 20th century, and despite intermittent dips and peaks in popularity, hard-boiled noir remains appealing to this very day. What I think did have merit, though, were arguments regarding Dame being insufficiently witty or current, to the mid-90s, that is. I'll start with the first problem, as whilst I'm in no position to criticise anyone else's prose, several reviewers specifically took issue with the quality of Dame's writing. To be blunt, in their opinion, it wasn't smart, and it wasn't funny.
A calendar shows you where the year's gone, but never shows you how to get it back. Those bins are talking, and I don't like the lingo. How about the mayor's new angle?
I didn't vote for him.
You didn't have to. Most of the people in the cemetery did.
PC Review was more forgiving of the game than most English-language critics, but nevertheless felt that the script isn't as witty as it wants to be, and Charles Ardai griped that Anger, quote, exercises his self-flagellating sense of humour so often that you want to put a bullet in him just to shut him up, unquote. Mark Morrison partially conceded this point, admitting that his protagonist never stopped moaning.
My desk. It's old, pitted, scarred, beaten up, and worn out. Like me.
Foreign language reviewers weren't as negative on the writing, which I imagine is because those Europeans reviewing the English version maybe didn't feel qualified to comment on that point, whilst those playing the later, localized versions of Dame were perhaps enjoying a script that played to the nuances of their own tongue.
Red Randall Hanna. Ein Berufsschläger. Macht nur selten den Mund auf und hat eine größere Moral als ein Piranha, aber nur geringfügig.
Oh, wer will was trinken?
But crueler Anglophone journalists agreed with Ardai that, as a tribute to Chandler-esque writing, Dame never really surpasses mediocre. Chandler once joked that the secret to good detective stories was short sentences, and Mickey Spillane's I, the Jury certainly took that advice to heart. But Chandler wasn't being entirely serious. His prose is famous for being as evocative as it is economic or accessible, and even the first Mike Hammer book, uncomplicated and unpretentious as it was, would sometimes venture into the self-indulgent, such as with the line, "She kept her coal-black hair long in a page boy cut, and wore tight-fitting dresses that made me think of curves in the Pennsylvania highway every time I looked at her." Spillane's later work became even more poetically inclined. If you think about Dame's dialogue compared to an extreme example, like the 1980s Marlowe series, which was adapted from Chandler's short stories and incorporated various quotes from the author's non-fiction work, then Beam's writing is quite hit and miss.
Frankie's makeup. I remember the scent of her perfume, and the taste of her lipstick.
What's almost ironic about this is that I think one of the reasons Beam fell short here was that they were genuinely trying to be somewhat original and not just regurgitate lines from earlier works. The opening to Under a Killing Moon is an interesting comparison because it's unquestionably much less serious and much less conventional noir fiction than The Dame Was Loaded. It goes from sci-fi pastiche to a spoof World War II newsreel to horror and finally gets round to Neo-Noir. By this point, there should be no chance of the game capturing the mood of Marlowe or Spade, but Access are so shamelessly, unself-consciously earnest in stealing from Chandler and his peers that this sequence actually does a great job of nailing the authentic hard-boiled detective feel, right up until about here. What's sad is that I think Dame's writers were really trying to come up with their own material, writing their own lines instead of directly copying everyone else's, which is a noble goal, it's just that they didn't quite make it. But let's come back to that second issue with Dame's writing I mentioned, its currency in the context of the 1990s. Again, I don't think the problem was that it was a traditionalist hard-boiled detective story. Those stories still found success even towards the end of the 20th century, as a cinematic adaptation of Elroy's LA Confidential proved a year or two after Dame's release. But it is important to observe something about the Neo-Noir of the 80s and 90s, that it tended to be modern in the sense of either originality or audience tastes. In the world of movies, a hard-boiled detective story was rarely a pure PI tale, but one of four things. The first was a hybrid of other genres. 1982's Blade Runner, for example, was cyberpunk neo-noir. 1984's City Heat was a PI/violent action/jazz buddy cop comedy, and 1988's Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a hard-boiled urban PI fantasy. The second category was outright pastiche, parody, or meta-commentary on the genre, like 1982's Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, which inserted Steve Martin and his co-star into various black and white noir classics, or the 1993 comedy Fatal Instinct, which blended one-time Mike Hammer actor Armand Sante's mid-century private detective with scenarios drawn from the erotic thriller genre. The third category, especially common, was modernized hard-boiled fiction. The Stacy Keach-led Mike Hammer show, for example, was generally very faithful to the source material, but moved from the 1940s to the 1980s, replete with computer fraud, drug deals and DEA agents, sleazy porn kings, Vietnam vets, and an endless supply of cosmetically augmented models, something I noticed upset some Spillane biographers, though you have to question why you'd be a Spillane biographer if that sort of thing offends you. A similar example in film might be the 1982 remake of I, the Jury, which made maximum use of its R rating to recreate the sex and gore of the original 1947 novel, whilst also making it feel topical by inserting a plot about CIA Black Ops and MK Ultra. And the final category was arguably the most faithful to the originals. Still hard-boiled noir, still set in the 40s or 50s, but intensely stylized, either in a mostly cosmetic sense to capture the spirit of media from the era, like the Powers Booth-led Marlowe TV show, or like LA Confidential, exaggerating some of the edginess or maturity of early noir, often again bringing it closer to the original literature. And if you look at FMV games of the 90s, that same pattern holds true with Dame's competition. Ripper was sexy, violent, and cyberpunk. The genre-bending Tex Murphy series was stylized, somewhat spoofy, and yet still modernized. Private Eye was both authentically Chandler and artistically exaggerated, and noir took its very appropriate title to the extreme, a classic PI joint, albeit as if from an alternate reality in which the Hays Code never took effect, and self-conscious of its inspirations. But if we turn our stony gaze on The Dame Was Loaded, it doesn't seem to have the appeal of any of those approaches. It's not really multi-genre, it's a pretty standard PI story, and though it sometimes tries for a slightly comedic tone, it never goes full bore, let alone maintains consistency. There are a lot of trite or unimportant scenes that are treated with the utmost seriousness, and then beatings and murders that are initially depicted as a joke and later as traumatizing. Nor is it really meta-commentary, it's self-aware but clearly not some sort of introspective art house rumination on the detective genre, and it's obviously not a modernized story, it's set in the 1940s. Since Dame didn't fall into any of the aforementioned categories, I think it was important it worked as the last one we covered, a 1940s noir for a 1990s audience, and if you'll forgive the digression, I'd like to go into a bit more detail on why reviewers thought it failed at that. One of the positives of both Private Eye and Noir's writing was that they sometimes felt adult, impactful, and darkly veristic in a way that played to the genre's strengths. Earlier in the video we talked about early hard-boiled literature being a bit edgier than the movies, but focused on surface-level elements like nudity and violence. It's also worth acknowledging, however, that the characters and the worlds and themes through which they strode were also fairly mature. Now, for the most part, social commentary they were not. Dashiell Hammett may have earned infamy among the public and admiration among intellectuals for being a full-blown Soviet-worshipping Stalinist, but that turn came several years after most of his best-known works were written. Even Poisonville, later published as Red Harvest, actually makes very little of its premise. The protagonist arriving at a mining town, semi-lawless after the local industrial magnate hired gangsters to put down a labor union and subsequently lost control of them. The Dashiell Hammett of the mid to late 1930s would undoubtedly have done more with this setup, but according to most biographers, there's no evidence he was using it as any sort of political statement at the time it was written, regardless of his or his partner in crime's later claims. And Chandler, a well-heeled writer by the standards of an ordinary man, remarked that his early education in an expensive, semi-prestigious public school in England had the benefit of inuring him to the barbs of politically conscious establishment critics, who he characterized as snide, elitist, and obsessed with social commentary or social criticism as the highest values to be found in fiction. Hence, he argued, their dismissal of the popular detective genre and its origins in pulp. Still, even if Dame's influences were not polemical, what they did do more overtly than their silver screen adaptations was depict urban America at its darkest, weirdest, and most corrupt. Chandler is sometimes credited, a bit unfairly, for taking murder out of the drawing room and putting it back in the gutter. Instead of lords and ladies, it was all gunsels and hookers. The world of a classic PI novel was populated by both the socio-economic and psychosexual underclass, from the immigrant to the heroin addict to the deviant, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes repulsion. Either way, the backdrop to these stories was a compromised one. Philip Marlowe in particular was often found in a dimly lit alley, a halfway house, a padded cell, or a raggedy boudoir. What I think Noir and Private Eye sometimes did well was representing this seedier side of semi-fictitious American city life, of what Hammett and Chandler saw as features of America's urban and moral decay. Several scenes in these games feel gritty, or dangerous, or just kind of sad. Alcoholics are glimpsed slumped over their desks. White powder spills out of imported pottery. The sound of the destitute and desperate being beaten up or shaken down drifts from adjacent alleyways. Another appealing element of Chandler's work is a degree of nuance and humanity to characters that are often portrayed in later PI media as one-dimensional archetypes. Marlowe is often unsure who to trust, and his stories are filled with lies and secrecy and sudden role reversals and such. Allies become enemies, victims are revealed as victimizer, a new piece of evidence sheds light on a character's possible intentions, and all that. What's important is that the reason for this is not only dramatic license, but also the fact characters feel multifaceted, very real and very human. Even at the end of the story, Marlowe and the reader is often unsure of each character's ultimate goal, or what their motivation was for actions they took during or prior to the events of the case. A gold-digging cabaret girl turns out to value her pride over her financial security. A mobster plays the paladin. An innocent becomes a killer. Things are never too neatly tied up at the end. The case is over, but Marlowe and often the rest of the cast only receive a measure of closure. Whether they received justice is up for debate. Private Eye captures this, which is cheating, obviously, since it's based on the original Chandler story, as does Noir, intermittently at least. Characters that should have come off as comedic, like the Sunset Boulevard-esque aging diva with a missing pup, can actually be quite sympathetic figures. I think this a pro of detective fiction, not just because it makes the characters more realistic and compelling, but because it ties into the murder mystery aspect. All of the people involved are human, and therefore all are capable of committing good or bad deeds. As catastrophic a letdown as Ripper's multiple endings were, it did capture the sense of your investigation uncovering inconvenient facts that would first point to one suspect, then another, then the second suspect giving a strong defense of their actions and hinting back at the first, then a third suspect materializing, and so on. It does sometimes make the randomized killer mechanic work, until the end, that is. Private Eye also made some headway with this concept via the alternate narrative mode. Any member of the cast could be simultaneously saint and sinner, and the player isn't sure who to trust. Dame doesn't quite hit that goal of humanizing or grittifying its setting, though. Most of the characters are very one-sided. Its semi-humorous tone means it doesn't communicate a sense of real danger, and it rarely commits to going for pathos in its characterization. Even when it does, it's undermined by the general self-conscious spoofiness of it all. I think Dame's world in general is just too safe and uncontroversial. There are black and Chinese characters, for example, but nobody to my memory ever comments on this fact. In Hammett and Chandler's writing, the narrator, protagonist, and cast would consistently point out that another character was Irish, or Italian, or Greek, or really anything other than plainly Anglo-Saxon. They would certainly comment on someone being Mexican, let alone African-American. You can probably guess they didn't use the term African-American, though. Again, I think all this comes from Dame being closer to noir film than noir fiction. Drug use, prostitution, and sexual deviancy could up to a point be implied in pre-production code movies, but certainly not to the level of openness found in pulp serials or novels, and were mostly excised during the Hays era, and even prior to the code, movies avoided phrases that were at the time considered ethnic slurs. Dame also demurs dwelling on more contentious topics like corruption, politics, or the international order. As we already covered, its literary inspirations are difficult to read as social commentary, but they do reflect how various writers viewed America from the late 20s to the early 50s. In Hammett's Red Harvest, the police are merely another gang, but are portrayed more positively in some of his other work. Chandler typically depicted the authorities as mildly, though not oppressively, corrupt. Marlowe had various friends in the police force who were often trying to do their job under difficult conditions, but he could also find himself the subject of harassment, beatings, and on a couple of occasions an attempted assassination by the boys in blue. In both writers' stories, the rich wielded considerable influence, but not absolute power, and Chandler in particular used their crimes less as social criticism and more as establishing a mood. PIs were meant for the streets, not the skyline, and certainly not the manor house, and the role of the upper middle classes and beyond was to show themselves as potentially grimy and vicious and hollowed out as their lessers, regardless of how much money they had. Even though a PI might occasionally find himself among high society, there was usually something rotten about it, a polluted bloodline, a religious mania, an unspeakable family secret. It is arguably here, speaking of the American elite, Chandler at least came closest to social commentary. The author acknowledged that some of the events referenced by Marlowe, the cover-up of an industrial heir's murder-suicide, the scandal of a crime lord's ties to the city's upper crust, were lifted directly from the Californian newspapers. But the Marlowe novels are more concerned with using this state of affairs as a backdrop than as a lecture, and Dame, I think, doesn't even go as far as Chandler or Hammett. There are references to political corruption, and the character of Denton implies that Big Joel Jones has friends on the force, but this doesn't really go anywhere. On the contrary, the Jones subplot can be tied up in a way that makes the authorities seem remarkably honest and overcompetent, considering the limited amount of evidence involved. Although the game's endings are hardly fairy tale, they're not Chinatown either. Nobody is crushed or cast aside by the immutable power of state and church or iniquity and industry. In fact, the game seems to discourage leaning too far towards vigilantism or undermining the law. Finally, despite Dame being set in the 1940s or thereabouts, you could easily forget that the world was in the midst of geopolitical and domestic turmoil, though this is definitely a theme more commonly found outside the original literature. Mickey Spillane's work, or at least specific novels, is actually the most explicitly political of the three icons of hard-boiled detective stories. Like most ordinary Americans of the day, Spillane and his protagonist were aggressively anti-communist, and whilst Mike Hammer would typically battle lone killers or organized crime, starting from 1951's One Lonely Night, he also began gunning down leftist radicals and Soviet spies. It struck me whilst reading Sally Klein's Dashiell Hammett Man of Mystery that despite how sympathetic, and in my opinion selective, the book was in its recounting of the writer's activities, I still found that Hammett, an angry, diseased, drug-addicted communist purportedly convicted of raping a Hollywood starlet, came across as exactly the kind of character Spillane's vigilante hero would probably blow in half with his .45. but fighting totalitarianism was more of a movie trope than a literary one when it came to the founding fathers of hard-boiled fiction. It does nevertheless pop up in later material, and in terms of games, Noir features a plotline involving a Nazi smuggling ring, whilst 1998's Black Dahlia initially plays with the topic of the German-American experience in the 1930s. I'm not entirely sure if Dame ever mentions the exact year in which it was set in dialogue. The calendar on the wall seems to read 1948, though I don't remember any obvious clues in the context of World War II or the Soviets or anything like that. That puts it in line with Chandler and Hammett, who don't dwell on politics in their original writing, but I suppose may have been a missed opportunity from a sensationalist marketer's perspective. Media set in 1930s or 40s America was as fond of Nazi spy rings as it was pinstriped suits or jazz or Cadillacs and Chryslers, whilst late 40s and early 50s placed noir sometimes included escaped war criminals or HUAC and such. The reason I covered these issues is because the degree of censorship applied during the transition from the written word to the silver screen is actually what helped give later noir media a second, third, or fourth wind. Because a lot of audiences were familiar with Chandler, Hammett, and even Spillane's work via the more family-friendly, or rating boards-friendly movie adaptations, neo-noir media is often able to make itself seem fresh by either being more faithful to the adult elements of the original works, or just exaggerating it. More gritty, more sexualized, more racially conscious, more politicized, or whatever. That, I think, is one of the problems Dame faced when it hit shelves in the mid-90s. Returning to the reviews, recall that whilst Computer Gaming World asserted Dame didn't work as a spoof because it wasn't funny, PC Entertainment said it didn't work as a hard-boiled detective story because it lacked the dark depravity that made noir interesting. In the context of classic noir movies, you could argue neither of these criticisms makes sense. Noir rarely crossed over with comedy, nor was noir of the 30s and 40s necessarily any more grim or sleazy than Dame was. But they do make sense if you see it from the perspective of noir fans in the 90s, when pop culture strongly associated the hard-boiled private dick with either metatextual comedy, the erotic thriller, or cynicism, social commentary, and violence. In PC Gamer UK's review, Steve Farragher described Dame as the sort of fare that, as a film, you would expect to see on ITV at 4 in the morning, explaining that it was startlingly unimaginative and relies entirely on parodying the detective genre. Farragher, like many reviewers, saw The Dame Was Loaded as a tired rerun of past classics. It's wrong to say that audiences then or now are sick of classic PI movies, but it is true that they need to distinguish themselves by either originality or appeal to contemporary audience tastes, whether that means being more witty, more unique, or just sufficiently shameless in catering to the intended demographic. Dame, as a title that was semi-spoofy but not fully comedic, set in the 1940s but stylistically restrained, and neither adult nor edgy, had trouble fitting in. I don't recall being aware of Dame at the time, but if I had seen adverts or reviews, I suspect I would have associated it with the safe, somewhat dated daytime TV noir watched by seniors from their sofas, and if I cared about FMV games, probably been more attracted to the stylish noir or Private Eye, the cool cyberpunk Tex Murphy titles, or the taboo of the sexy and exciting Ripper. But market conditions in the 90s are hardly your concern. Not everyone appreciates stories about brutal vigilantism, seedy exploitation schlock, post-depression era misery porn, snooty social satire, or the various other forms into which the genre evolved. Dame's writing may not be as gritty as Chandler, nor as crowd-pleasing as Spillane, but it is unconceited, authentic to classic movie noir, innocently light-hearted, and sometimes entertaining without employing shock or sleaze. And for you, maybe that's enough to make it worthwhile.
I've been involved in many interactive storytelling types of products over the years, some with video, some not with video, and clearly I think They haven't solved the problem, but they have found an interesting approach to the problem, and I really think that users of the product are going to sense that, are going to be very compelled to play this product, to be able to play it many times, to get many different things out of each time they play it, to really become a part of the human drama.
I get the feeling that we're in a cutting room in 1908 or something, and we just discovered what a close-up was. You know, it's so primitive what we're doing. It's so exciting in trying to figure out what this new medium is.
Beam Software were by no means the only developer to misread or misprophesize the home computer market in the mid-90s. In a retrospective on Take-Two's Ripper, design lead F.J. Lennon recalls how, during breaks in shooting the game's FMV footage, most of the crew would forego the chance to harass its Hollywood stars, and instead sneak off to play the recently released Doom 2. Realizing right then that the $4 million project was outdated before it had even been finished, Lennon recalls thinking to himself that, quote, "A game was not a movie, and a movie was not a game." Even so, The Dame Was Loaded isn't a straightforward exemplar of the interactive CD-ROM adventure so accursed by critics in the mid-90s. Whilst there's no doubt the perception of Dame as a generic FMV game injured it, looking at its mechanics, it was doing some interesting things with real-time worlds, multi-solution puzzles, and semi-non-linear progression. Even if, like me, you don't think these systems ended up working so well in the final product, they might be worth revisiting if you're a player who wants to experience an adventure that's a bit different from both the interactive clip compilations and the missed clones of the era. And Dame's bad luck in launching about the same year as half a dozen other detective adventures is, for modern players interested in the genre, an opportunity to play several titles that took quite different approaches to each other, mechanically and artistically. If you're interested in hard-boiled detective games from the 90s and have never played any of those I mentioned in this review, first consider the Tex Murphy series, which was very popular for its time. Under a Killing Moon, for example, is generally considered a classic of the genre, and equally importantly, is available to purchase and play today. I'd like to suggest those who wanted a more traditional first-person adventure try Noir, a shadowy thriller, and those interested in a real Philip Marlowe adventure go for the officially licensed Private Eye, but unfortunately, as of writing, neither of those can be legally acquired online. If you're willing to be a bit more adventurous and look slightly outside the same time frame, however, you could pick up Westwood's Blade Runner from 1997, a cyberpunk detective story which, like Dame, had a stab at randomization, a partly non-linear narrative, and multiple endings. Or again, if you're willing to put some work into acquiring and running it, try 1998's Black Dahlia for a more traditional period piece FMV game. In any case, whether you're interested in Dame, one of the other adventures, or none of them, my work here is done. Thank you so much to Mark Morrison for both answering my questions and putting up with me talking over him every 5 seconds over Zoom. Thanks also to Penny Love, Chaosium, Andre from Campaign Coins for putting me in touch with Mark, and a big thank you to the Stay Forever podcast for their original 1-hour interview, which was conducted in English and can be found on both their YouTube channel and website. As always, it's due to fans like that, and willing retro developers, that I'm able to research these games for my own channel, so do consider supporting them instead of parasites like myself. What I've talked about in this video is only a sliver of the no doubt interesting story of Dame's development, so hopefully in the future, someone else might be able to uncover some more details about it. And we're at the end of another retrospective. Thanks for watching, I know it's very late again, and I hope it was all moderately interesting. Our next retrospective will be on Ocean Software's JRPG-inspired Silver, which in 1999 was marketed as Europe's answer to Final Fantasy VII. No doubt that will take me a few months, so you really should find something to occupy yourselves in the meantime. Goodbye until then, have a good summer, and take care of yourselves.
A woman has faces along with airs and graces. embraces, but there's only one true woman inside. The average fellow won't sight it. The side she keeps most private, it's only seen through private eyes. A woman exposes expressions and poses, making men think she's got nothing to hide. Day and night they see a mask, but the man who sees her last is the one who looks through private eyes. The veil falls aside, releasing the disguise with the touch of her glove. A candlelit embrace, standing face to face, those private eyes see love. The woman is tried by eyes from every side. Through smoke and haze, men see her and sigh. They see the shadow of her smile, a reflection of her style. She only warms to private eyes. From every side, through smoke and haze, men see her and sigh.